Hey you, still awake? Good, because tonight we're going to pull open a creaky wooden door and step quietly into a world long buried beneath our feet. A world without clocks, without screens, without sofas or snacks or phones, just smoke, silence, and the slow rhythm of survival. This is not the castle. This is not the monastery. This is the bottom, the beginning. The peasant's hut. So before we begin, take a second to gently tap that like button and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we do here. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? It's always a little magical to see this quiet corner fill with so many sleepy souls from across the map. Now go ahead, dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade out, and let your thoughts soften like wool left in the rain. We're not in a hurry, we never are. The peasant Sepp's hut, dirt floors and dreamless sleep. If you stood outside the hut long enough, you'd begin to feel it. Not see it, because there's very little to see, but feel it. The way the cold clings to the thatch above you, the way the smoke seeps out from somewhere near the roof, not in a stream but in little wafts, like the sighs of someone who's too tired to keep exhaling. The walls aren't quite straight. They're more suggestion than structure. Wattle and daub, woven twigs packed with mud, hay, maybe some manure. You could press a fingertip to the inside wall, and it would squish a little. You could smell the old dampness of winters gone by. Inside, it's not much brighter than out. The doorway has no door, just a flap of something heavy, maybe a piece of woolen cloth or leather. The floor is dirt, real dirt, flattened hard by feet over years, and those feet belong to people like Elric and Ansa. No one famous, no one dangerous, just a husband and wife who've never been more than a few miles from this spot. They live here with their children, 2, maybe 3. The youngest is still small enough to sleep in the pile of rags near the hearth. The hearth, in fact, is the heart of the hut, nothing more than stones arranged in a circle with an iron pot hanging above it. It smokes constantly. There is no chimney, only a hole in the roof that doesn't do its job very well. It smells in here, not in a cruel way, just in a very real way. Boiled greens, animal fat, wet wool, smoke, the breath of animals, and people sleeping too close together. A pig might be asleep in the corner, maybe 2 chickens. This is normal. The animals provide warmth in winter and waste in summer, but either way they are part of the furniture. The bed, such as it is just a pile of straw in one corner. There might be a blanket, if you're lucky, otherwise it's old cloaks, whatever sackcloth could be salvaged, or just each other. And sleep isn't the escape it is today. It doesn't come gently, wrapped in silence and luxury. It comes when the body gives in, after hours spent bending over in fields, hauling water, mending clothes, scraping soot off pots. It's dreamless not because they didn't dream, but because they were often too tired to remember. There's no privacy, no rooms, no locks, one space, one fire, one life that folds in on itself every dusk and unfolds again at first light. You'd think this was a sad life, and in some ways it was, short, painful, often uncertain, but it had rhythms that modern lives no longer know: when to sow, when to reap, when to fear the frost, when to trust the warmth. These people knew the shape of the moon, like we know our schedules. They could hear the difference in the wind between a passing storm and something that would ruin the barley. Elric has been up since before dawn. He has no clock, but he knows time by the light in the sky and the heaviness of his limbs. He moves slowly but with purpose. His bones ache, not from illness, but from life. He wraps a cloth around his waist, drinks a swallow of thin ale, it's safer than the water, and steps outside to begin his morning. He doesn't say anything. He rarely does. Words are saved for need, not for noise. Ansa stirs when the baby wakes. She doesn't panic. There's no rush. She's used to the small body squirming against hers. She shifts, soothes, pulls a piece of cloth over the child's feet, and watches the pale square of daylight creeping in through the door flap. Another day, another set of hours between one pot of pottage and the next. The same tools, the same fire, the same hands grinding the same grain into the same gritty meal. Sometimes, she remembers a song her mother used to hum. She can't remember the words anymore, only the sound. She hums it anyway. The children wake slowly. They don't bolt upright. There's nothing to race toward. They squirm, stretch, scratch, and eventually stumble toward the fire. Elric will be gone most of the day, laboring in another man's field. Ansa will tend the small patch of garden outside. It's not enough to feed them, but it helps. She knows every turnip, every weed. She's whispered to them, cursed them, watched them rot and rise again. Once a week, if weather permits, they walk to the village. It's not a village the way we'd think of one. Just a few huts clustered around a church and a shared well. There's a smithy, a communal oven, and sometimes, if the tax hasn't been too cruel, a bit of bread sold by the widow with the twisted back. She always squints at the sky, as if expecting God to lean out of it. The local reeve stops by now and then. He doesn't knock, he just lifts the flap and steps inside. Elric straightens when he hears the boots. Ansa keeps her eyes down. If the tax is due, they will pay it. If they can't, they'll promise. And if they can't promise, they'll give what they can. An egg, maybe a woven basket, maybe time. Promises were a kind of currency too, but not everything is grey. There are moments, strange flickers of beauty, when the smoke catches the sunlight just right and fills the hut with gold, when a neighbor's baby giggles and everyone laughs, even if they don't know why, when the village gathers for a saint's feast, and for a few short hours, everything feels like more than survival. At night, after the chores are done, and the fire has burned low, the family lies down on their straw. There's no bedtime, there's no routine, only exhaustion. Sometimes, Ansa tells the children a story she half remembers, a knight, a dragon, a river of honey. She never finishes it. They fall asleep too fast, and above them, the night rolls in heavy and slow. The stars blink through the smoke hole, the pig sighs in its sleep, the wind scratches at the door flap, and the dirt floor presses cool and real beneath them, as if the earth itself is trying to hold them still. And there, in that quiet hut, with its strange little miracles and daily aches, the medieval peasant sleeps, not peacefully, not always safely, but deeply, in a world that moves slower than ours, and dreams not of riches, but of rest. The cowherd's wage, life on the edge of hunger. The cowherd rose before the sun. He always did. There was no rooster in his hut, only the sound of his own breath, pulled from sleep, like thread from a tangled spool. The cold met him as he sat up. No fire, just the familiar sting of damp wool and aching joints. He moved carefully, quietly. His boots, still crusted from yesterday, waited by the door. So did the stick he carried, not for walking, but for guiding and occasionally scolding. Outside, the fields were still sleeping. The stars hadn't yet vanished, and the grass shimmered with dew. But the cows, slow, solemn creatures, were beginning to stir. They had to be taken out early, before the village grew loud, before carts rolled, and children shouted, and the dogs ran loose. The cows liked quiet. So did the cowherd. He was not a landowner, not really even a tenant. His place in the world was measured, not in land, but in hoofbeats. He did not plough or plant. His job was movement, watching, wandering, waiting. The cattle were the Lord's, or the church's, or sometimes the village's, a shared herd cared for by one man, with more patience than ambition. His hut was on the edge of things, near the common pasture, near the brush, not quite part of the village, but not wild, either, just far enough away to be forgotten most days. He didn't mind. Solitude had its own kind of richness. The cows did not speak, but they listened. They understood his voice, not his words, but the shape of them. A sharp, and they turned. A soft murmur, and they waited. A whistle, and they followed. He knew them by name, of course, not the names they were given at birth. He didn't have time for that, but the names he gave them. Stubborn one, Twitchy, Queen, the one with the limp he called Old Nun because she always walked behind and looked mildly annoyed. His wage was small, a few coins per season, sometimes food instead, bread, a strip of salted pork, a cask of ale. Once he received a pair of mittens knit by the reeve's wife, and they were so fine he wore them only on church days. But the job came with its own rewards. A cowherd could eat the wild berries before anyone else found them. He could nap beneath the trees without being questioned. He could see the storms before they arrived, and smell the thaw of spring before anyone else knew it was coming. He knew where the foxes denned, where the mushrooms clustered, where the land dipped just enough to collect rainwater in clean, clear pools, and he could think. Hours of thought, uninterrupted. That was the hidden wealth of the cowherd. Time to remember, to wonder, to dream without speaking. Hunger, though, was never far. If a cow sickened, it might be his fault. If one wandered too close to the woods and vanished, whether to thieves or wolves, he might find himself beaten, or worse. If winter dragged too long, the cows grew thin, and the villagers blamed him. When there wasn't enough butter in the spring, someone always asked if he'd been careless. He didn't argue. There wasn't much use. Instead, he worked. He walked with the cows from morning until evening, whittling sticks, humming old songs, watching birds wheel through the sky. When they grazed, he rested. When they moved, he followed. When one lagged behind, he went back. The seasons shaped his days. Spring was mud and calves. Summer was flies and sweat. Autumn brought wind and horned heads lowered against the cold. And winter was hardest of all. Hooves slipping on frost, bellies rumbling, cows too lean to milk. He wrapped rags around his hands and walked anyway, because the herd needed him, and no one else would take the job. At night he returned to his hut, a small fire, a crust of bread, maybe a boiled onion or two, if the steward had been generous. Sometimes he added a splash of milk, a luxury he never admitted aloud. He watched the fire crackle, and listened to the night sounds, owls, wind, the creak of trees. He had no books, no candles, but he had memory. He recited old tales under his breath, stories his grandfather had told him, kings and dragons, ghosts and miracles, all of them safely tucked behind his eyelids, ready to keep him company. Sleep came slow but steady, the weight of the day pressing him down, the cool of the night pulling him deeper. He dreamed sometimes of green fields with no fences, and cows that never strayed, and warm kitchens that smelled of stew. Dreams were free, after all. The cowherd had little. His pockets were empty. His name rarely spoken, but his eyes were wide open, his ears filled with wind, and his footsteps steady on the edge of things. He was neither rich nor poor, in the way people counted wealth, but he belonged to the land more deeply than most. He moved with it, and in his quiet, hungry way, the cowherd endured. The village miller, flour, favor, and quiet power. The first sound in the morning wasn't a rooster. It was the groan of timber, the slow turn of the mill wheel, water slapping stone. The creek had its own rhythm, faster in spring, sluggish in drought, always speaking in some soft ancient tongue, and nestled beside it, with moss on its stones and flour dust in its bones, stood the mill. The miller's world turned with that wheel. All day, every day, grain went in, flour came out, but what most villagers never thought about, what they didn't see, was what happened in between, and what that meant. Inside the mill, it was never quiet. Even before dawn, the air hummed, grinding stones sang in slow, low tones, dust floated through beams of golden light, sacks of grain slouched against each other, like sleeping beasts, and in the middle of it all was the miller. Not rich, not noble, but not quite poor, either. Not quite. He didn't plough, he didn't reap, but nothing happened without him. Wheat from a dozen peasant fields passed through his hands, and what came out the other side, fine, pale flour, could be turned into bread, or beer, or payment. He took his cut, of course. That was the rule. The law said he could keep a portion of every load for his labor, for the wear of his mill, for the secrets of his trade. How much did he take? That depended on the year, on the mood, on who was watching. A dishonest miller might skim more than his due. A clever one would make it look fair. A cautious one would weigh every bag twice, especially when the reeve came sniffing. But a wise miller took just enough to stay useful. Never so much he was hated, never so little he was forgotten. The villagers knew his name, they had to, and they needed him, even if they grumbled. Without the mill, their grain was just seeds, and no one wanted to grind it by hand, not when the wheel could do it faster. So they came, on foot, with carts, with burlap sacks, and hopeful faces. And the miller, broad-shouldered, white-fingered, always smelling faintly of yeast, greeted them with the same nod, the same shrug, the same weighing glance. He knew things too, quiet things, who had a good harvest and who didn't, whose sacks were lighter this year, who added stones to bulk up the weight. He heard stories while flour fell, gossip, bargains, sins whispered just a little too loudly, because people talk when they wait, especially near turning water. The miller didn't speak much, he listened, and he remembered. He wasn't noble, he lived in a sturdy house, not a manor. His boots were worn, but well made. He owned no land, but he owned the stones, the gears, the great wooden teeth of the wheel, and in the village, that made him more than a man. It made him necessary. He wasn't quite trusted. Too much money passed through his hands, too many secrets. But he wasn't feared, either. Not like the bailiff or the baron. The miller could be bribed, he could be reasoned with. He might even forgive a debt, if you came with the right story, and a warm loaf. On feast days he drank at the front table, not with the lords, but near them. His children were clean, his wife wore rings. He could read, if not well, then well enough, and he could count, better than most. There were dangers too. Millstones could shatter, floods could carry off the whole building, accusations of theft or witchcraft could ruin a reputation overnight, and if the grain was bad, moldy, diseased, too wet, it could make the whole village sick. The line between service and suspicion was thin, but the miller knew how to walk it. He kept the gears oiled, he paid the tithe, he kept extra grain hidden in the loft, just in case, and he gave the priest a sack of fine flour every Lent, quietly, without asking for thanks. He knew which children were hungry and which had flour on their cheeks. He knew whose shoes had holes and who had new buttons. His job was to feed the village, and in doing so, he became part of its memory. At night, the wheels slowed, the stones cooled, the dust settled. He wiped his hands, sat by the fire, watched his daughter knit by the candle, and listened to the hush that only comes when the whole world's been ground smooth. The miller slept deeply, not because his work was done, but because tomorrow it would begin again, and the wheel would keep turning. The widow's garden. Survival by herbs and hope. The old gate creaked when it opened. It always had, just a splintered bit of wood, tied with twine, leaning sideways on a post half-eaten by moss. No lock, no latch, just a gentle protest, as you pushed your way into a garden, shaped more by necessity than design. This was not the herb garden of a monastery. It was not square, neat, or charted in any parchment. This was something else, a widow's garden, tucked behind a slanting cottage, half-shadowed by the trees, nestled between the laundry line and the chicken's fence. If you blinked, you might mistake it for weeds, but if you looked closer, you'd see nettles near the steps, because they kept the worms away, mint in the corners, to mask the smell of boiled greens, leeks, wild onions, fennel, mugwort, comfrey, garlic, tansy. It wasn't pretty, but it had purpose, and so did she. She wasn't young. Her fingers were shaped by years of kneading, stitching, pruning. Her back curved, not with age, but with habit. She moved like someone who couldn't afford to waste motion, and she looked at the world like someone who already knew how the story ended. But her eyes were clear. The village might have forgotten her name. They called her the widow now, or her, the one in the cottage near the stream. But they remembered her face when they needed a salve for a burn, or a tea to help the baby sleep, or a string of words whispered over a fevered brow. Because the widow knew things, and most importantly, she grew them. In this world, food was wealth, and knowledge was power. She had a little of both, not enough to be safe, just enough to survive. Her husband had died, long ago now. A fall from a cart, or a bad cough in winter, or maybe just the slow surrender that came with hunger. No one asked any more. The village mourned him, then moved on, but she stayed. Some widows remarried, if they were young, some were taken in by family. But some, like her, found a quiet middle path, not quite alone, not quite dependent, just overlooked. She owned the garden, or perhaps the garden owned her. The land was borrowed, of course. Technically it belonged to the Lord, like all things did. But no one else wanted it. Too shaded, too rocky, too close to the edge of the woods where the foxes howled and the fairies whispered. But it grew. The widow's day began before the birds stirred. She checked her traps, fed the hens, gathered yesterday's herbs and laid them on the cloth to dry. Each leaf had a place, each root a purpose. She didn't read, but she remembered. Recipes passed by voice, generation to generation, half in rhyme and half in prayer. She knew which bark eased bleeding, which berry brought sleep, which flower might kill if you weren't careful. She sold none of it. That would be dangerous. The church had its own views about women who healed, but she gave, and sometimes gifts came in return. A crust of bread, a worn shawl, a kind word, enough. The children came first. They weren't afraid. They sat by the stump while she worked, listened while she muttered. Sometimes she gave them a sweet root to chew, sometimes a warning. Always something. And still, the garden grew. Even in winter, when the snow curled like parchment across the earth, there were dried herbs wrapped in linen in the rafters. Even in drought, she knew where the dew gathered thickest in the morning. Sometimes the priest visited, not in public, quietly. His sister had a cough. His joints ached. He never asked where the widow had learned all this, and she never told. Sometimes the reeve came too. Not for medicine, he came for the stories. He sat stiff on the stool and asked about the old times. What had happened to the shepherd boy with the crooked leg? Was it true she'd seen a comet the night the miller's barn burned? She always smiled, said little, and sent him home with something bitter for his liver. She wasn't feared, but she wasn't fully trusted either, and that was fine. Fear brought torches, trust brought chains, but suspicion kept people just close enough. She prayed, not loudly, but faithfully, and when the church bells rang, she stood outside her door with the others. She bowed her head, she sang the words, but her gospel, it was green. The real sermon was in the leaves. At night, the garden sighed, crickets whispered in the hedges, the stars turned slowly above, and the coals in her hearth dimmed from orange to red to black. She sat in her chair, weaving nettle thread through the holes in her sleeve. Outside, the mint was still fragrant, the earth was still breathing, and in her dreams, when they came, there were no voices, no bells, no shadows, only roots, only green, only the slow quiet rhythm of a life that asked for nothing more than to keep growing. The blacksmith's forge, smoke, sweat, and social clout. There is a rhythm to the forge, a steady heartbeat of hammer on iron, of bellows and breath of fire that never quite sleeps. It begins before sunrise. The air is still cool, but inside the smithy, it's already warm. The coals from yesterday were buried in ash, still faintly glowing. All they need is breath and patience to spark again, and he has both. The blacksmith, he's not nobility, but when he walks through the village, people step aside. He's not wealthy in coin, but he is rich in necessity. No one eats without tools. No one builds without nails. No horse rides far without shoes, and none of that happens without him. His clothes are dark with soot, stained beyond saving. His beard smells faintly of smoke. His hands are thick, his fingers scarred, his grip strong enough to twist iron. But there's something else in his movements, precision. He doesn't just hit things, he listens to the metal. The forge stands on the edge of the village, not far but far enough. The heat, the noise, the flying sparks, those are better kept slightly apart from livestock and laundry. It's a simple structure, stone walls, timber frame, a sloping roof, blackened with soot. No door, just a wide open mouth to let the smoke escape and the neighbors peer in. They do sometimes, children especially, because inside, it's magic. The smithy glows from within. Firelight dances on the walls. There's a wheelbarrow filled with charcoal, a stack of iron bars near the hearth, tools hanging like bones from every rafter. Tongs, hammers, punches, files, each with its place, each with a story. He knows them all. They've shaped horseshoes, hinges, sickles, swords. They've broken bones, mended fences, saved harvests. They carry the weight of 100 quiet triumphs. A blacksmith doesn't work quickly. He works properly. Iron is stubborn. It doesn't bend just because you want it to. You have to understand it. Know its color when it's ready. Know the sound it makes when it yields. Know how long it can stay in the fire before it burns. He's learned by doing, by failing, by watching his father and his father's father, by feeling the heat in his chest, the spark in his bones. He doesn't read. He doesn't read. But he speaks the language of metal fluently. People come to him with requests. A broken plow, a missing hinge, a lock that needs a new key, a blade that's gone dull. Sometimes they pay, sometimes they barter, sometimes they owe. He keeps track in his head, not on paper. He doesn't need to be reminded. The Lord sends for him when something in the manor needs repair. The reeve consults him before market days. Even the priest brings candlesticks when they've gone crooked from years of use. The blacksmith listens, grunts, nods, then gets to work. There's sweat, of course. It's not a clean trade. He's often streaked in soot before midday, his apron stiff with grime. His face shines in the glow of the flames, his eyes red from smoke, but he doesn't mind. There's pride in what he does. A sense of place, of being needed. He knows that when a neighbor draws water, it's from a bucket with his handle. When the children run across the green, it's on shoes held by nails he made. When the harvest is reaped, it's with blades he sharpened. He is everywhere, and yet often unnoticed. Sometimes when the day is over, he sits on the stump just outside the forge and listens to the evening settle in. The sky glows purple, The last hammer strikes still ring in his ears, his hands ache, his back groans. But the fire is still alive behind him, banked for tomorrow. His wife brings a bit of bread. His youngest runs to sit on his lap. His oldest already helps at the anvil. There's not much talk, just the quiet comfort of usefulness. In winter the forge is a beacon. Villagers gather nearby just to warm their hands. In summer, its heat is tolerated because it means tools will be ready for the field. He's not a priest, not a soldier, not a lord, but when the world falls apart, when carts break, doors crack, chains rust, they come to him. He doesn't smile much, but he notices, and when the moon is high and the village quiet, he stirs the coals one last time, adds a pinch of charcoal, and listens to the fire's breath as it settles back into its long glowing sleep, just like he will, soon enough. The shepherd's path, wandering the Lord's edge. Before the rooster stirs, before the dew dries, and long before the village even begins to blink awake, he's already walking. Not quickly, not heavily, just steadily, boots softened by grass, cloak tugged by wind. He has a stick in one hand, and in the other, nothing. His hands are usually empty. That's the way of shepherds. All they carry is time. His sheep are ahead of him, clumped in loose little clouds, their hooves quiet in the dirt. They know where to go, and so does he. The shepherd isn't rich, not by any measure. He sleeps on straw. He eats coarse bread and hard cheese. He owns few things, but what he does have is distance, a quiet, a space between him and everything else. Because while most peasants spend their lives tied to a patch of land, a field, a fence, a plough, the shepherd walks. His domain is the edge of the fields, the woods, the moors, the parts of the world that aren't quite claimed, but not quite wild. He knows every stump, every rock, every rabbit hole. He stepped over them 100 times. The life of a shepherd is simple on the surface, but not easy. Rain falls, and he stays with the flock. Snow comes, and he stays with the flock. A wolf slinks through the underbrush, and he stays with the flock. There's no one else out here. No church bells, no gossip, no reeve checking his work. Just him, the wind, and the animals. They are not clever. They wander, they panic, they fall into things, but they know his voice, and he knows each one, not by name, but by the shape of their ears, the way they limp, the sound they make when they're cold. He hums, sometimes, low, tuneless sounds that seem to hang in the morning mist, not to entertain, just to mark time, and he watches the sky, the weather, the line of the horizon. A shepherd doesn't just look after sheep, he reads the earth, the way the grass is growing, the way the clouds are moving, the softness of the ground beneath his feet. He knows things others don't, not from books or sermons, but from watching, day after day, year after year. When he needs to rest, he sits on a rock, maybe chews a bit of bark, maybe eats something, if he remembered to bring it. Often he forgets. Sometimes another shepherd passes by on the far slope. They don't always speak, just a nod, a shared silence, a flick of the staff in greeting. Out here, words aren't currency, time is. In the village, people know his name, but don't know him. He's always away, always out past the hedgerows, where the air is different and the birds sound wild. They see him on feast days maybe, a rare time when someone else watches the flock. He comes in with mud on his boots and burrs in his hair, sits near the back of the church, nods politely, and leaves before the bread is cold. They don't know he's the reason the village has wool, that the blankets on their beds were once soaked with rain on his back, that their cloaks and mittens come from the animals he guards with a patience most people can't even imagine. Sometimes he dreams while walking, not in the way others do, just drifting thoughts, of far-off hills, of green places never seen, of sky so wide it makes the chest ache. He's never been far, but his feet have touched more ground than most men ever will. When he returns at night, the sky is already deep with stars. The sheep settle. He checks them one by one, rubs his thumb across their noses, listens for the sounds that don't belong. Then he builds a small fire, just enough for warmth, lies on his side, wraps himself in wool, and closes his eyes. There's no door to lock, no roof to leak, no walls to creak in the wind, but he sleeps, deeply, because he knows that out here, in the quiet dark between fields and forest, the world has shrunk to a circle of warmth and breath and trust, and that for a shepherd is enough. The Reeves Ledger, a peasant who could count. He wasn't born to numbers, few were, But somewhere between planting seasons and the parish tithe, between oxen yokes and barley sacks, he learned, not from books, from tally sticks, from grain heaps, from careful observation and stubborn memory, and eventually from the Lord's steward himself, who noticed this quiet man didn't just follow orders, he understood them. And so, one year, the village reeve died. A good man, mostly honest. And when the Lord's men came asking who would take his place, a few heads turned toward him. And that was how a peasant, still wearing patched boots and eating stew with turnip and bone, became the link between lord and village. The reeve was not a lord, not even close. But he wasn't just another peasant anymore either. He didn't plough full days in the field anymore. Didn't haul dung or sow seed shoulder to shoulder, not as often. His back still ached. His hands were still rough. But now he carried a different burden. Responsibility. Because if someone didn't count the bushels, didn't track the tools, didn't remind old Edric that he owed a chicken this month, and not next, then the entire manor could lose favour. Or worse, be fined, or punished. He didn't want that. Not for his neighbours, not for his children. In the early morning, while the mist still clung to the hedges, the reeve walked with a ledger tucked in cloth beneath his arm. It wasn't fancy. A few pages, a wooden cover, bits of parchment tucked in with notes. But it mattered. It held numbers. Records. Agreements made over handshake and mud. He knew which cow had calved, who was late with their labour, which field had underyielded, which tenant was getting too old to do what he'd always done. He remembered who borrowed a scythe and didn't bring it back. He remembered everything. People didn't always like the reeve. That came with the role. He was one of them, but also slightly apart. He had to report to the steward, had to collect when no one wanted to give, had to enforce rules that made no sense, but couldn't be ignored. Sometimes someone would mutter behind his back, say he'd gone soft, say he was too close to the manor. But when old Denner's son broke his leg and couldn't work the barley field, it was the reeve who quietly arranged for the neighbours to take over the rows, and then smoothed it out on paper so no one got fined. When the steward demanded 2 pigs from a household that only had 1, it was the reeve who argued, and won. He didn't live in a bigger house. He didn't wear better clothes. But there was a steadiness about him. The way he stood in the centre of a muddy lane, listening carefully. Not quick to speak. Not quick to judge. He didn't talk much. But when he did, people listened. Once a week, he walked to the manor. Not in haste. Just with focus. Ledger wrapped in cloth, boots laced tight, cap pulled low. He would stand before the steward and read the numbers. Grain tallies. Labour records. Tool inventories. Names and dates and debts paid in chickens. The steward would nod, make notes, and sometimes, if he was in a good mood, ask the reeve to stay for ale. But most days, it was just in and out. The reeve preferred it that way. At night, by a single candle, he would sit with his tally sticks. He would mark the notches, whisper names under his breath. He wasn't afraid of the dark. He knew it well, but he also knew how quickly things could unravel if no one paid attention. So he paid attention. Sometimes, he missed the simple days. Back when he just followed the plough. Back when his world was a square of dirt and sky. But then he'd see his daughter writing letters with borrowed ink, or his wife spinning wool beside a warm fire, bought with wages earned for keeping things in order, and he'd think, this is what progress feels like. Not freedom, but maybe the first page of it. Not wealth, but maybe something wealthier than hunger. And when he laid down at night, ledger tucked safely beneath a basket, he didn't dream of castles or coins. He dreamed of numbers, small familiar numbers, bushels, eggs, days worked, the quiet rhythm of a life counted carefully and lived fully. The monastic novice, poverty with purpose. He came with nothing, no shoes, no bag, just a threadbare tunic, a bruised apple, and a name he would soon be asked to forget. The gate creaked when he pushed it. The cloister was colder than he imagined, quieter too. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm village evening, but something deeper, something still, the kind of silence that felt older than he was, older than anything. He was 17, maybe. His mother wasn't sure. She'd sent him here with a kiss and a blessing, and a whispered hope that he might one day read, or at least learn to pray with more than fear. And so he entered, a novice. They shaved his head, that first night. Not all the way, just the crown. The tonsure, they called it. a visible sign of invisible obedience. He barely flinched. He was too cold to care. They gave him a robe the color of dust, a wooden bowl, and a thin wool blanket. They did not give him answers, or comfort, or warmth, but in time, those would come, in strange forms. His days began in darkness, long before the sun, a bell, a rush of cold water, bare feet on stone floors. He followed the older monks in silence. No talking before lords, that was one of the first rules. There were many rules. He didn't understand them all, but he obeyed. He knelt when they knelt. He stood when they stood. He bowed when the abbot passed, even when his knees ached. The words they chanted were in Latin. He didn't know Latin yet, but over time the syllables blurred into something soft and comforting, like a lullaby sung by ghosts. He learned slowly. First, how to tend the garden. The monastery grew most of its own food: onions, leeks, cabbage, herbs for healing, herbs for flavor, herbs for prayer. He learned which plants needed shade and which liked sun, how to tuck straw around the roots when frost came early, how to catch slugs in the morning with shallow bowls of milk. He learned to compost, though no one called it that. They just dumped scraps behind the old chapel wall. Later he learned to write, not in his own words, not yet, but he copied, over and over, letters on parchment, careful strokes with a reed pen, ink that stained his fingers and took days to wash off. He loved it, the smell of vellum, the whisper of the quill, the sense that he was recording something bigger than himself. He ate twice a day, a bowl of porridge in the morning, pottage in the evening, sometimes bread, sometimes cheese, sometimes on saints' days, fish, no meat, not ever, except for those in the infirmary, and only if they were truly dying. It wasn't delicious, but it filled the space where hunger lived. The library became his favorite place. He wasn't allowed there often, not alone, but when the prior permitted him to clean, he did so with care. He dusted the shelves like they were relics, which in a way they were. He'd seen no more than 12 books in his whole life. The monastery had over 200, each one hand-copied, bound in leather, heavy as a loaf of rye. He dreamed of reading them all, of understanding the strange loops and dashes, the drawings of saints and beasts, the lines that curled like vines around golden letters. He missed the world, sometimes, missed the sky without a ceiling, the chatter of markets, the crack of boots on frozen mud. But the world had never been kind to him. The monastery wasn't kind either, but it was steady, predictable, ordered. He liked that, and he found purpose, in cleaning, in chanting, in learning, in service. He wasn't important, he never would be, but he belonged. No one asked for coins here, no one struck him when he spilled something, no one laughed when he prayed too loudly. They just corrected him, quietly, patiently, sometimes with a glance, sometimes with a verse. He would not inherit land, he would not take a wife, he would not grow old with grandchildren at his feet, but he would leave something behind, a prayer copied in ink, a garden well tended, a life lived in rhythm with the bells. He never owned a thing, and somehow, that felt like peace. The Alewife's brew, fermentation and fortune. If you followed your nose through the village square, past the smithy's hammer clanging, and the cries of children chasing geese, you'd smell it before you saw it. Warm, wet, yeasty, a scent of barley, smoke, and something just a little wild. The Alewife's house didn't look like much. Wattle and daub walls, a crooked chimney, a heavy wooden door swollen from last spring's rain. But inside, it bubbled, it sang, it brewed, because inside was ale, not the kind you might picture in a golden goblet beside a throne. This was earthy stuff, cloudy, thick, made by hand with grain and guesswork, and whatever the air brought in through the open shutters. The Alewife, her name was Mera, didn't learn to brew from books. She learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers, who probably never called it brewing at all, just cooking. It was woman's work. Men had their guilds, their laws, their apprenticeships. But alewives worked alone, often in silence, often with secrets passed like sourdough starters from one hand to the next. Mera's hands were stained from the mash. Her nails always smelled faintly of hops and heat. She had no husband. He died during a bitter winter, crushed under a wagon wheel that no one could afford to fix. She had no sons, just 2 daughters, and the barrel. Every morning before first light, she stirred. Big wooden paddle, copper kettle, fire stoked low with damp peat. She brewed with barley when she had it, with rye when she didn't, with oats when the barley ran dry, and the rye was promised to the baker. She added herbs too, not just hops, which were still new and strange to some, but sage, yarrow, heather, even a pinch of rosemary if she could spare it. The flavor changed with the seasons, with the wind, with the mood of the day. No two brews were quite the same, but all of them were drinkable, most of them were good. A few were unforgettable. She sold her ale by the jug, sometimes a halfpenny a pot, sometimes a barter, eggs, cloth, the promise of labor come harvest. Some days she broke even, some days she didn't, but every few weeks, someone would knock at the door with a thirst too heavy to carry. The miller, the reeve, even the parish priest. And when the brew was strong, when the foam was thick, and the fire was lit, the coins came easier. A few extra for the better Paul, a nod of respect that women like her rarely got. She kept no ledger. Her memory was sharper than ink. She knew which neighbors owed her, which paid in gossip, and which came not for ale but for company. Because Mera did not just brew, she listened. To the widow whose son was taken by fever, to the young wife whose belly stayed flat no matter how many prayers she whispered, to the soldier, home from a skirmish he couldn't quite forget. Her cottage was small, her bench narrow, but for a few quiet hours, it was safer than church. Of course there were dangers. The ale could sour, the fire could catch, the bishop's men could come knocking with accusations of unlicensed brewing, or worse, witchcraft. She kept a low profile, paid the tithe, avoided talking too much to the bailiff's wife. But still she felt it, the eyes, the suspicion, a woman who lived alone, who handled coin, who made men sleepy with a smile and a mug. Mera knew her reputation wasn't spotless, but her buckets were, and her customers came back. Her daughters learned too. The older one was good with herbs, the younger, good with numbers. Together they watched her paddle the wort, skim the scum, taste the sweetness with a practiced tongue. She didn't speak much while brewing. Words could curdle the boil, her mother used to say. Whether it was true or not, didn't matter. Brewing, like prayer, was better in silence. Sometimes Mera would dream of a different life, one with a shop, a sign, a servant to fetch firewood. But then the sun would rise, and the barley would steep, and she'd dip her hand in the warm, dark grain, and feel something like joy. Not wealth, not fame, but purpose, steady as the turning seasons. And on feast days, when the brew was blessed by the priest himself and served to the whole village in big wooden cups, Mera would stand at the back, arms crossed, apron soaked, and watch them drink. Not just peasants, not just men, everyone. And in those moments, brief, quiet, and easily forgotten, she was in her own way the richest woman in town. The bailiff's hall. Authority in muddy boots. The bailiff wasn't a lord, not quite, but he wasn't a peasant either. He lived somewhere in between, closer to the manor, but not inside it. Respected, maybe. Feared, more likely. The sort of man whose boots were always muddy, whose hands were always full of parchment, keys, or complaints. He walked the edge of two worlds, and he walked it alone. His hall, though calling it a hall, was generous, stood slightly apart from the village, a stone's throw from the manor gates, timber-framed, thick-walled, with a roof of red tile that didn't quite match the thatch of the peasants or the slate of the lord's keep. Inside, a fire that never quite warmed the place. A long table, a desk with drawers that stuck, hooks for cloaks, a shelf of brittle scrolls, and beneath the floor a locked trap-door that no one talked about. He slept upstairs, on a straw mattress that smelled of ink and damp wool, but sleep rarely came easily. Every morning before sunrise, the bailiff was up, scratching his name into fresh records with a dull quill. He recorded debts, tallied taxes, counted eggs, sheep, barrels of grain. He knew exactly how many hens the widow owned, how many fence posts had rotted on the yeoman's land, and how much ale had disappeared from the manor cellar after the last feast. Not because he was cruel, because that was his job. He answered to the Lord, but only just. The Lord wanted results, not excuses. Grain in the storehouse, rents collected, order kept. The bailiff was how that happened. If someone didn't pay, the bailiff visited. If the village pigs wandered too far, the bailiff fined them. If two neighbors fought over a fence line, the bailiff drew it again, in chalk, in stone, in silence. He carried a short staff, not for show, but to remind. He wore a small iron ring on one finger, a symbol of office, and in his belt pouch, always a set of worn wax seals, ready to stamp names and lives into law. Some saw him as the enemy. Others saw him as protection, because while the bailiff could take, he could also shield. A whispered word to the steward, a warning before inspection, a missing name on the wrong list. It wasn't corruption, it was survival, and everyone knew how the game was played. His boots mud-caked, cracked, walked from field to field. He inspected fences, scolded millers, recorded births, oversaw the ploughing. He listened to endless complaints about stolen tools, sick cows, cold wives. He nodded, he sighed, sometimes he helped, sometimes he didn't. But he always remembered. At the end of the day, when the candles burned low and the parchment curled in the fire's heat, he would sit at his table and count again. Tithes, rents, labor owed, names of those buried, names of those born. And sometimes he would stop, let the numbers fade, and think about the years, about the faces, about how much he had seen and how little he had truly owned. He had no wife, no children, just scrolls, ink, a silence that lingered long after the door was shut. But come morning, he'd rise again, pull on the boots, pick up the keys, and step back into the rain-soaked world where nothing was fair and everything was due. Because in the medieval village, power didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore wool, smelled of wet parchment, and kept its voice low. Sometimes it lived in a hall with muddy floors. Sometimes it was the bailiff. The yeoman's field. Freedom bought by the acre. The yeoman's boots were his badge, worn but solid, stitched tight with care. Unlike the rag-wrapped feet of peasants or the perfumed slippers of lords, his boots were built for walking long rows and pacing land that answered only to him. Not rented, not borrowed, owned. And that changed everything. A yeoman didn't kneel before a reeve. He didn't owe days of unpaid labor at the manor or grain tithed on someone else's whim. He paid his taxes. He showed up at muster when the horn called men to arms. But otherwise, the land he ploughed was his, and the land was what gave him peace. His cottage stood proud at the edge of the fields, built from oak beams cut by his father's hand, a real floor, not dirt, windows with shutters, even a second room, where his sons slept shoulder to shoulder and dreamed of harvests to come. Behind the cottage, the fields ran like a patchwork quilt, some barley, some rye, a corner for peas, a narrow strip of beans, nothing wasted, every inch mattered, and in the center, always, was the yeoman. He woke with the sun, not to someone else's bell, but to the rustle of chickens, the creak of the well rope, the quiet shift of fog lifting off the crops. His day was his own. Hard, yes, but chosen. He walked the rows with a staff and a steady eye. He turned the earth with hands shaped like tools. No stewards watched him. No bailiff counted his chickens. Because he was the count, he owned his plough. He owned his oxen. He owned his mistakes. When the crop failed, there was no lord to beg, no monastery to lean on. But when the crop flourished, the bread was thicker, the table warmer, the roof patched before the rain came. The price of freedom was risk, and he paid it gladly. On feast days, he stood with other free men, his neighbors, his brothers, his friends. They didn't wear livery, they wore earth, sun-leathered skin, linen shirts, and pride that didn't speak loudly, but held its head high. The priest nodded to them. The reeve listened when they spoke, because a yeoman's voice, when needed, carried. He knew the feel of each furrow, the lean of the land underfoot, the way crows circled before a storm. He knew how to bargain at market, and when to stay silent. He knew how to teach a son to scythe barley cleanly, how to mend a fence with no nails, how to boil nettles into soup when coin ran low, and he knew what it meant to say, "This is mine," not in arrogance, in reverence. Evening came quiet on a yeoman's farm. No rush, no orders barked, just the low sound of animals settling, the sharp scent of wood smoke, the scratch of a knife whittling a new handle for a tool he refused to throw away. Inside, bread cooling, stew thickening, laughter soft as wool, and sometimes, if the moon was full, he would walk the line of his field and press his boot heel into the soil, as if to remind the earth, and himself, that they belonged to each other. He wasn't rich, but he wasn't poor. He was something rarer, independent, and in the long stretch of medieval life, that might have been the finest wealth of all. The merchant's stall, velvet, spices, and soft lies. The stall opened with a creak and a breath of scent, foreign, layered, unexpected, cinnamon and sweat, leather and lavender, a whiff of something sharp, unfamiliar, and expensive. It was the smell of coin, and coin was exactly what the merchant chased. He was not born to silk. His father had sold pigs, his mother had counted beans, but somewhere between counting and haggling, the merchant found a taste for better things. He began with buttons, small ones, polished bone, scraps of brass, then cloth, undyed linen first, then dyed well, and then spices. Always the spices. They bought him his boots, they bought him his teeth, and eventually they bought him power. The merchant's world was not built from fields or from fealty. It came from movement, from wagons and ship holds, from contracts scribbled on the backs of parchment, and whispers passed in wine halls late at night. He sold pepper by the pinch, silk by the square, and gossip by the glance. Because in town, knowing was currency, and merchants were rich in knowing. His stall was not a stall, not really. It was an empire folded under canvas. Bolts of cloth from Flanders, rings from Venice, perfume from somewhere that only arrived after months of dangerous water, and behind it all his smile, measured, quiet, friendly enough to invite you in, sharp enough to send you away with fewer coins than you expected. He didn't lie, but he never told the whole truth either. People trusted him, but not too much. That's how it had to be. He dressed well, wool cut close to the wrist, leather shoes always clean, a little silver clasp to mark his place in the town guild, not a noble, not a priest, but richer than both on a good day, and a man to whom other men owed things, favors, introductions. Discreet silences. He lived above his own shop, rooms with shutters, painted wood beams, a wife who kept accounts better than he did, and children who learned to count before they learned to read. He hosted dinner with merchants and abbots. He had wine, not ale, and books, not many, but enough. He laughed a little louder when the reeve passed. He bowed a little lower when the bishop visited, but only a little, because merchants knew things. And those who know are never truly poor. Of course there were risks, carts that never arrived, salt that spoiled in the rain, a customer who vanished without paying, a noble woman who smiled, promised to pay in spring and simply forgot, or chose to. But the merchant didn't rage. He just raised his prices the next day. He watched the town from behind his wares, watched boys run past with muddy feet, watched priests mutter with tight lips, watched knights clatter through with banners too bright for the mud they dropped. And he knew all of it would pass through his stall, eventually. Even the bright things, especially the bright things, because even lords needed wool, and merchants knew where to find the best. By night he counted, not prayers, not sheep, but coin, and in that quiet ritual, he found his peace, because the merchant was a man of margins, and when the day ended he always knew exactly what he had gained, and exactly what others had lost. The town watchman, midnight bells and silent streets. The torch crackled low in its iron sconce, smoke drifted up the alley, like a spirit too bored to haunt, and the watchman, hunched in his faded blue cloak, paused for a moment to lean on his staff and listen. Nothing, perfect. Because in a town like this, silence was a kind of wealth. He wasn't rich. He didn't wear armor. He didn't ride a horse. His boots were cheap, his belt was fraying, and his lantern rattled when he walked too fast. But he had a key, and keys, in a medieval town, were more powerful than swords. The town watchman was not a sheriff, not a knight. He answered to the mayor, barely, and to the knight, entirely, because when the sun went down, the law belonged to him. He walked slowly, deliberately, across stones, polished smooth by generations of barefoot children and hobnailed traders. His task wasn't to catch anyone, it was to be seen, to remind the restless and the drunk and the dangerously curious that someone was still awake, that someone might be listening, that someone might have a name, a face, and a club. The town gates were shut after dark, the drawbridge drawn, the portcullis lowered with a groan that echoed off the walls like the breath of a sleeping beast. But inside, life continued. A cough from the alehouse, a baby's cry behind shuttered windows, the soft thud of a cat knocking something over it shouldn't. He noticed it all, registered it, catalogued it, and kept walking. He had a rhythm. Down the main street, past the apothecary, cut through the narrow cut known as Turnip Alley, Glance up at the bell tower. Listen for rats behind the bakehouse, and always, always check the water pump. Sometimes it froze, sometimes someone tried to drink from it after vomiting in it. People were inventive. He wasn't paid much, a few pence a week, a spot at the back of the mayor's feast come Michaelmas. No title, no banner, just a job. But it gave him something other men didn't have: privacy. He saw the town when no one else did. Not the version on market day, not the noise and bustle of Sunday after church. The real town, the quiet one, the one that whispered instead of shouted. He knew whose husband snuck home too late. He knew which apprentices slipped out to kiss beneath the eaves. He knew which merchant kept odd hours, and which cellar door always sat open just a little too long. He wasn't nosy, he just noticed. Because noticing was his job, and memory was his protection. No one loved the watchman, but no one wanted him gone either. He was part of the furniture now, a fixture, a piece of the clockwork that made the town run, even when the sun wasn't watching. He had no armor, no fortune, no power to punish. But he had the bell, and if he rang it, really rang it, people came running. And that in the end was what mattered. So he walked, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to let the sound of his boots remind the walls and windows that someone was there, just enough to keep the fear away. And when the stars faded and the first rooster coughed into the cold air, he would hand over the key, take off his cap, and vanish back into his corner of the world, where the town would forget him until night fell again. The parish priest, celibate, penniless, and powerful. The chapel was never quiet, not truly, even after the last candle was pinched out. After the townspeople had shuffled home with their prayers half finished and their sins half confessed, there was still the creak of old wood, the shifting of stones, the sound of mice rummaging in the corners like little doubters, and seated near the altar in a plain chair carved by a bored apprentice, 2 decades ago, the parish priest sat in thought, his fingers twined loosely in his lap. He had nothing, no wife, no children, no inheritance. He did not own his cassock. It belonged to the church. He did not own the small cottage beside the chapel. It too belonged to the church. The bread he ate, the wine he drank, the pen and ink he used for his ledgers, none of it was his, not really. And yet, he had power, not the kind measured in coin or sword, but the quiet kind, the kind that slipped through guilt and grief like wind through a narrow window. In the peasant's hut, they called him father. In the merchant's stall, they bowed. At the manor, even the Lord crossed himself when the priest passed by. Because this man, this quiet man, with worn shoes and a voice like dry parchment, was the soul keeper. He baptized your baby. He married your daughter. He forgave your sins, or didn't. And when your time came, he stood beside your grave and gave you words to carry into the earth. Not all priests were holy. Some were lazy, some were cruel, some used their pulpits for whispers of power and advantage. But even so, the collar held weight. In a town without doctors, he was the healer. In a village without letters, he was the reader. In a world without comfort, he was the comforter, when he could be. His days were long and full of small concerns. The chapel roof leaked again. The candles were half spent and too expensive to replace until Michaelmas. The parish register was smudged from the baker's wet thumb. The widow Thomasina had once again declared the end of the world was near and refused to feed her goat. He listened. He advised. He wrote letters no one else could write. And on Sundays he climbed the pulpit and preached sermons meant to soothe, scold, and steer. He had read more books than most in the village knew existed. Latin, Greek, Scripture, saints' lives, dusty codices passed hand to hand between churches. His mind wandered far beyond the fields and hedgerows, and yet, his feet remained planted firmly in mud. He waded through it to bless crops. He knelt in it to tend the dying. He lived among the poorest, and was one of them, in coin if not in consequence. He had taken vows, to live without wealth, to live without a wife, to live without certainty, beyond the certainty of death and redemption, and still he smiled when children ran past his window. Still he nodded to the shepherd boy bringing wool to the chapel door. Still he hummed hymns under his breath as he patched his worn-out cloak for the 100th time. Because in the rhythm of bells and prayers of seasons and psalms, there was purpose, there was order, and to him that was enough. At night, he lit a single candle. He wrote his day's thoughts in a cramped, angular Latin few others would ever read. He prayed, not for greatness, but for clarity. And when the wind howled down the nave like a hungry ghost, he simply pulled his cloak tighter and whispered, Amen, and tomorrow he would rise again, to bless, to bury, to speak, to listen, to stand between heaven and the muddy, aching world and do what he could. The mayor's feast, modest wealth behind city walls. The gates close at dusk, not with a clang but with a long, dragging groan, the sound of wood swollen by rain and stone worn by countless evenings. Beyond the wall, the fields fall quiet. But within the city, a different rhythm begins. Lamps are lit, footsteps shift from hurried to slow, and in the mayor's house, just off the main square where the cobbles are a little smoother, and the air smells faintly of spice and smoke, a meal is being laid, not a royal banquet, not a peasant's porridge, something in between. The mayor is not a king, but within these walls, his name is known. He walks like a man who's used to being listened to but not feared. He doesn't wear velvet, but his tunic is well made and clean. That alone is wealth. Here, he eats from pewter, not gold, but still he eats well. His hands are ink-stained from ledgers, not blistered from a plough. His wealth is civic, drawn from taxes and tolls, permissions and penalties, and though he doesn't own the city, he runs it, more or less, or so he likes to believe. The feast is a modest affair, but carefully arranged. A loaf of fine bread, its crust dusted with flour and scored in a cross. 2 chickens, spiced with herbs bought from the apothecary's wife, turnips and parsnips, boiled just long enough, a small pitcher of wine, red, watered down, and pears, stewed in honey, enough to impress a visiting merchant, not enough to offend the poor. The mayor understands optics. His wife oversees the plates with a quiet precision. She does not speak loudly, but nothing escapes her. The spoons are polished. The fire is hot, but not smoky. The guests are seated by order of importance, but it all seems effortless. These are the games of town power, softened, subtle. There are no swords here, just smiles. At the table are a few of the guild leaders, one from the weavers, another from the fishmongers, a notary, a priest, a visiting mason, who's in talks about the new bell tower. Each speaks politely, but each watches the others closely. Even in friendship, there are boundaries. Who gets the better cut of chicken? Who's poured the first cup of wine? The mayor sees it all, and makes small adjustments. He is not a ruler, he is a balancer. By candlelight, talk turns to trade routes, winter grain reserves, the toll road dispute with the neighboring town. Nothing too urgent, but nothing careless either. The mayor listens more than he speaks. He's learned the value of silence, and when he does speak, it's often to ask a question that seems small, but lingers. How did your apprentices manage the flood repairs? What are you hearing from the tanners? Do you think the pilgrims will pass through again this spring? This is how he governs, not from a throne, but from a bench at supper, with favors, food, and firm memory. He knows who didn't show up last week. He knows who didn't return a borrowed horse, and he files it all away, not with anger, but with interest, because someday he'll need a vote on the new market tax, or help smoothing over a quarrel between the bakers and the brewers, and then that forgotten horse might come back up. After the feast, the guests leave in 2s and 3s. There are handshakes, laughter, and beneath it all, quiet calculations. The mayor stands in the doorway, nodding to each one, as they disappear into the flickering lamplight. He closes the door, sighs, removes his belt, and for a moment, he is just a man again. Feet sore, stomach full, mind heavy. Upstairs, his eldest son snores softly, tangled in blankets. His wife is already half asleep, one hand resting on a candle-lit page of Psalms. He moves through the house quietly, not from fear, but from habit. Mayors do not need to shout to be heard. They do not need to rule by fear, to hold power. They just need to remember everything, and everyone. And tomorrow, when the bell rings over the square, the mayor will rise with the city, not to rule it from above, but to keep it turning, from the middle, one word at a time. The knight servants, nobility from below the saddle. The knight rides tall, gleaming, if he can afford it. Polished armor, high boots, banners catching the wind like silent thunder. But behind that shining silhouette, trailing just a few steps back, just outside the portrait frame, is a world rarely noticed. The knight's servants. Tonight, we walk in their shoes, not the ones for battle, the ones made for following. Every knight, no matter how noble, is carried by horses, of course, but also by hands. Hands that pack the saddlebags, hands that sharpen the blades, hands that lace the armor, hands that hold the reins when the knight is busy waving to a lady or glaring meaningfully across a field. These hands belong to squires, pages, grooms, cooks, and washerwomen. Some born into servitude, some climbing, some stuck, but all of them essential. Take the squire, the closest shadow, often a younger noble, or one who hopes to become one someday. He learns by doing, mostly by doing for someone else. He rises before the night, checks the tack, oils the mail, folds the cloak just so. He polishes the sword hilt, like it's the Holy Grail. He memorizes the contents of the saddlebag, not because he's told to, because he knows he must. There are no small forgettings in war. Behind him, a page, even younger, often 12 or 13, nimble and nervous. He watches the squire, learns the rhythms, he carries water, runs errands, holds the knight's spare gloves like they're relics. He dreams of armor, but sleeps on straw. He's been slapped once for stepping on a banner edge, twice for speaking out of turn. But he's learning. Soft steps, eyes low, hands fast. He knows the knight's cough, his moods, the way his brow tightens when he's about to lose his temper. Knowing these things is survival. Farther back, in the camp's smoky edge, the grooms tend to the horses. They don't care about lineage or honor. They care about hooves, oats, and the strange way one gelding twitches before rain. They don't eat at the same table as the knight. But without them, he doesn't ride. And deeper still, the servants who never even see the battlefield, the cook who travels behind the retinue with a cart full of salted meat and hard biscuits, the washerwoman who scrubs blood from tunics she wasn't around to see bloodied, no titles, no songs, but they know the knight's size, his stains, his habits. They carry his victories, laundered, salted, packed away. At night, the knight sleeps in a tent, the squire just outside, wrapped in a cloak too short. The page curled up in a corner like a forgotten boot, one ear open. Always, sometimes there is respect. The knight offers wine, a word of praise, a hand on the shoulder, sometimes nothing. Sometimes worse, a bad mood, a bruised ego, a lash of the tongue, or worse than words. But the servants endure, not just for coin, for proximity. To serve a knight is to stand one rung higher on the ladder, and maybe, just maybe, to climb. In the hall back home, the knight is toasted. The squire stands behind the chair, quiet. The page waits by the wall, tray in hand. The servants are invisible, but they hear everything. Plans, secrets, boasts, confessions whispered over wine. They know when the knight lies, when he trembles, when he cannot sleep. And still they follow, because even if they carry the saddle instead of riding it, even if they never touch a sword, they belong to that strange shadowed nobility, nobility from below the saddle, not heroes, not names on scrolls, but the ones who made the pageantry possible. Step by quiet, step. The falconer's secret privilege in feathers and glove. The castle is quiet this morning, save for the wind. But if you listen just past the stone walls and the stable yards, you might hear something stranger, the flutter of wings, the jingle of tiny bells, a sharp, proud cry from high above the trees. Not a songbird, not a dove, something wilder. A falcon, and with it, always nearby, the falconer. Tonight, we follow him. Falconry in the Middle Ages was more than a hobby. It was a signal, a Game of Thrones played in feathers and silence. To own a bird of prey, especially the rarer kinds, was to show your status, but to control one, that took skill, time, patience, and one man held that power. The falconer. He's not a lord, not a knight, not a bishop, but he walks through the castle gardens with quiet immunity. The nobles greet him. The stewards nod, he goes where others can't. High towers, private courtyards, the king's own lawn, because on his gloved hand sits a living emblem of control, a hawk trained to kill on command, and return like loyalty with wings. It's a fragile trust, one built not through words but repetition, reward, and something close to love. The falconer rises before dawn, not for prayer, not for chores, for training. The birds must be fed, weighed, checked for lice, talked to like fussy nobles. Their moods shift with the seasons. They sulk, they rebel, they preen, but they know his voice, his scent, his rhythm. He wraps their feet in jesses, covers their heads with soft leather hoods. The hoods keep them calm. Or maybe it just hides the world until they're ready. The bird is carried to the hunt with a practiced hand, every step measured, every eye watching. A lady might gasp, a lord might lean forward, a child might point from the hedgerow. When the hood is removed, the air stills, the bird stretches, the sky takes notice. Then, in a moment, release. The falcon soars. The noble cheers. The prey scatters. The falcon dives, silent and deadly. A perfect strike means meat for the table, and pride for the household, and for the falconer, maybe a coin, maybe a nod, maybe nothing at all. But his satisfaction is in the moment, the curve of the wing, the return to glove, the whispered understanding between man and creature. Few in the medieval world moved between classes so fluidly. The falconer dined in the servants' hall, but stood at the lord's elbow. He might own no land, but was known by name to those who ruled it. He might walk beside the queen without being asked to leave the path. It was an odd kind of privilege, borrowed, conditional, wrapped in feathers and leather. There were secrets too. Some birds refused to return. Some killed the wrong animal. Some turned wild again, forgetting the voice of the hand that raised them. And sometimes, just sometimes, the falconer let them go. Not every freedom needs an audience. At night, the falcon sleeps on its perch. The hood covers its eyes, and the falconer, alone now, rubs the aches from his fingers, counts the mice left in the pouch, strokes the worn edge of his glove, where the bird always lands. He dreams of flight, of treetop winds, of the feel of talons shifting, gently in trust. He dreams like a servant who knows the scent of nobility, and the sharp edge beneath it, not quite noble, not quite common, balanced on a gloved hand, and always watching the sky. The Baron's Court, land, law and lying it, begins with a seal, pressed wax on rough parchment, bearing the crest of a lion or a cross or some long-dead ancestor's proudest memory, a sign that the Baron is in session, that the gears of justice, clumsy, expensive, slow, have begun to turn. Tonight we take our seat at the side of the Baron's Court, but mind your words. Here, everything is written down and remembered. The Baron is not a king, but in his lands, he may as well be. He speaks law, he owns land. He commands men-at-arms, and oversees disputes both petty and profound. A pig in someone else's garden, a fence moved by moonlight, a miller accused of skimming flour, a woman accused of hexing a cow, and sometimes, bigger things, treason, theft, blood. It all ends up at the Baron's feet. He sits in a heavy chair, carved with vines. His boots are thick with mud from the ride-in. He is not always clean, but he is always watched. One clerk records each case. Another guards the fines. A third counts how many times the Baron sighs before declaring his ruling. He does not do this alone. There are advisors, lesser knights, a reeve or two, sometimes a priest, occasionally his wife, quietly knitting beside him, listening more than anyone expects. To speak in court, a peasant must bow low. To win a case, he must bow lower. But it's not all fear. Some bring gifts. A goose, a bottle of good cider, a promise. These are not bribes, not officially. They are traditions, customs, ways of showing that you understand how things work. Because in the Baron's Court, understanding the dance matters more than the facts. A man accuses his neighbor of stealing a sheep. The neighbor accuses him back, of stealing his daughter's honor. The daughter blushes, but says nothing. The Baron drinks, thinks, shrugs. He finds them both. Order in its strange medieval way is restored. But the court is not only a place for punishment. It's a ledger, a memory, a public theater of hierarchy. Land is transferred here. Marriages approved. Names added to parchment. Sometimes, a child becomes a squire with just a nod. Sometimes, a woman wins back her garden with just the right words. Sometimes, someone is hanged. It is not fair. It is not kind. But it is familiar. The Baron knows this. He sees the fear, the hunger, the slow crawl of ambition. He sees the way peasants look at the parchment, as if it were magic, as if their fates were sealed, not by God, but by ink, and in truth, they are. By twilight, the court ends. The Baron rides back to his manor. He carries no parchment, no sheep, just the sound of voices still echoing, petty arguments, quiet desperation, laughter in the margins. Behind him, the villagers disperse. Some relieved, some bitter, some planning next time. Because there is always a next time. The clerk stays late, tallying coins, filing parchment, sealing one more letter in red wax. And somewhere, in the shadows of the Baron's Court, another story begins, of land, of law, of lying with a straight face and a bowed head. The castle cook stewing for lords, eating the leftovers, long before the rooster stirs, the kitchen is already alive. Not with joy, exactly, but with movement, quiet and constant. Knives, scraping, cauldrons creaking, bread rising slowly beside the embers. The castle cook has no luxury of sleep, and tonight we're standing beside her. Not a noble, not a knight, not even a guest, but a cook. And in the castle's pecking order, she's somewhere below the dog, but above the rats. Usually, her name is forgotten by the ledgers, but not by the food. She wakes in the dark, tastes for salt, tests for heat, plans not for hours, but for bell strikes. The nobles dine when they wish. She eats when she can. This is a life of anticipation, because at any moment, a feast could be declared. A visiting noble might appear unannounced. A hunt might bring back a stag, or a squirrel, and whether it's stew for 40 or a plate for 1, it must be perfect. Or someone gets whipped, not always the cook, but always someone. Her kitchen smells of smoke and onions and things left too long in the corner. There are sacks of barley, baskets of leeks, strings of dried herbs, no recipe books, just memory and instinct. She supervises 2 boys and an old man who might once have been a monk. The boys chop carelessly. The old man snores beside the oven. A scullery maid drags water in with a yawn. And in the center, the cook reigns, flour on her arms, fire in her bones, and no time for nonsense. The nobles upstairs want sweet pastries today, but the only fruit in the larder is half rotten. Time to improvise. This is not the romantic kitchen of a modern fantasy. There are no gleaming copper pots, no helpful mice. There are flies, there is shouting, there is a leg of goose that smells slightly wrong. There is no room for error. And yet, when the platters go out, steaming, shimmering with glaze, the nobles nod. The lord compliments the sauce. The lady asks for more honey. No one remembers the cook, but they always remember the meal. At night, when the fire dies down, the cook finally eats a heel of bread, a spoon of stew, a few good bites of what's left behind. She could sneak more, but she won't. Not tonight. Tomorrow's stew starts with bones saved in silence. Once she dreamed of more. A bakery in town. A place of her own. But dreams are for girls, and she is far past that. Now her dreams are of quiet kitchens. Of meals served on time. Of nobody getting sick. Small, safe dreams. The kind that keep you fed in the deepest part of the night. She wraps a damp cloth over the rising dough. She checks the embers. She presses her palm against the stone for warmth, and she sleeps, sitting up, next to the hearth. Because dawn is always just a breath away, and the nobles will want eggs. The lady's maid, velvet touch and veiled rules. The castle is silent when she moves, not because no one hears her, but because no one dares speak when she passes. Her footsteps are soft, like a memory. Her sleeves don't rustle. Her eyes stay lowered. Her back never bends, unless it must. She is the lady's maid, and her world is a whisper behind velvet curtains. It's easy to mistake her for part of the furniture, a shadow by the dressing table, a flicker of motion in a mirror. But her role is precise, practiced, and far more powerful than it seems. She sees everything, the size, the secrets, the laced bodices and unlaced ones, the smudged love notes, the slipper tucked too neatly under the bed. The lady never speaks of these things, but the maid knows. She wakes earlier than the lady and sleeps long after her. By candlelight, she lays out gowns, fastens rows of buttons that seem to multiply with every passing year, polishes buckles, pins hair. Her hands are swift and firm, gentle where needed, but never unsure. There is no margin for error. A wrong shade of ribbon, a crooked seam, and the mood for the entire day shifts. And moods, in a castle, are as contagious as plague. She isn't family, but she knows the family better than they know themselves. She isn't noble, but she touches nobility every day with combs, corsets, and calloused fingers. And though her status is low, her closeness to power gives her something rare, awareness. She knows who favors whom, which brother is being sent away, which pregnancy is being hushed, which marriage is already falling apart beneath the silk. She says nothing, but she knows lunch comes and goes. She nibbles while folding linen, dips stale bread in cooled broth. Dinner is worse, because she is waiting to unlace the gown, to remove the jewels, to blot the lipstick and rub the rouge from her lady's cheeks. all while listening to soft complaints about society, manners, or men. Then in silence, she helps her lady slip into nightclothes and disappear into the canopied bed. The moment the curtains draw closed, she begins her real work. Cleaning, sorting, stitching, pressing. Sometimes she sings quietly to herself, songs no one remembers but her. Other nights, she's too tired for melody. She just works, because dawn waits for no one. She has her own chamber, small and spare, above the kitchen's. It smells of starch and herbs, and on her shelf sits a tiny carved box, her only real possession. Inside are 4 things: a lock of her mother's hair, a ribbon the lady once discarded, a scrap of lace she means to fix one day, and a ring cheap, worn and hidden from sight. She never wears it. She never speaks of it. But some promises, even broken ones, are kept in silence. She dreams lightly, not because she's afraid, but because she's trained herself not to fall too deep. The lady might need her. A fire might spark, a visitor might arrive, or the world might change without warning. In the castle, everything looks solid, but beneath the velvet and wax, everything is made of dust and rules, and she knows every rule, especially the ones no one speaks aloud. The squire's training, awkward wealth in waiting. The armor doesn't fit, not quite. It clanks when he walks, and pinches when he kneels. His boots are too stiff, his sword hilt too smooth, his posture too proud or not proud enough. It depends on who's watching, but he wears it anyway, because he's the squire. And one day, if all goes well, he'll be a knight. For now though, he is mostly a sponge, soaking up orders, soaking up insults, soaking up the expectations of 100 years of chivalry compressed into one awkward growing boy. He sleeps in a narrow bed in a cold stone chamber, just off the great hall, close enough to hear the echoes of laughter and wine, far enough not to be invited. He wakes early, always. At dawn he sharpens blades, polishes mail, saddles horses. He learns how to bow, not just physically, but socially, when to speak, when to be silent, when to offer a joke, and when to let one land without reply. He is learning the art of presence, of carrying himself as someone who might someday matter, which is harder than it sounds. His lessons include swordsmanship, of course, but also dancing, heraldry, table manners, how to hold a goblet, how to hold a grudge. There are tutors, yes, but the castle is the real classroom. He watches the knight he serves, the way he rides, laughs, commands a room. He studies the knight's silences just as much as his speeches. One day the knight will give him a sword and a title, and say, "You're ready, but not yet. Not for a long while." The squire is neither servant nor noble. He's in between, too clean to muck the stables, but not clean enough to sit at the table's high end, too noble to be ignored, too junior to be obeyed. And in this grey space, he learns the thing they never write in the manuals. Wealth isn't about gold, it's about confidence, timing, and knowing when to be useful. Sometimes he's called to deliver messages, sometimes to carry armor, sometimes in private moments, to hold a weeping noble's hand or to pull a drunk lord from a fountain. He sees things he will never speak of, learns secrets he can never repeat, because loyalty is part of the job, even when it costs you sleep. At night he lies awake and dreams in scattered fragments. The sound of hooves, the ring of steel, a lady's glance he wasn't supposed to notice, a banner with a symbol that feels like home, even if he's not sure where home really is. He wraps a thin blanket tighter and stares at the timbered ceiling. One day, he'll have a sword of his own. One day, they'll kneel for him. But for now he waits, he learns, and he tries not to grow too fast, because becoming a knight isn't just about armor, it's about patience. The Lord's steward, order, in the shadow of power. There is a man who doesn't wear armor, doesn't sit on a throne, doesn't shout orders or boast of victories, but the castle would crumble without him. The Lord's steward, he walks quietly, with a ledger under one arm, and 1,000 invisible weights on his shoulders. Not swords, not enemies, not fate. No, what he carries is more exhausting. The entire schedule, supply chain and mood of a medieval estate. He knows how much grain is left in the storehouse, how many candles the chapel burned through last week, which servants are feuding, and which barns need rethatching. He knows when the taxes are due, how many pigs were slaughtered last autumn, and how many chickens vanished without explanation in April. He is the walking memory of the manor. In the morning, before most have risen, the steward is already counting. bread loaves, wool bales, empty jugs. He speaks with the cook, the reeve, the bailiff, not to command, but to arrange, to ask the right questions in the right order, so everything continues without collapse. He doesn't shout, he doesn't need to. The steward speaks in a low, dry tone that makes even knights pause and nod, because if he forgets, the whole castle forgets, and no one wants that. He writes, endlessly. His little room tucked behind the chapel is a sea of parchment and wax, tallies and requests. He keeps accounts with ink-stained fingers, often by candlelight, but he also walks, between halls, between lives. He sees things no one else is meant to see. Arguments in corridors, servants crying in corners, noble women glancing too long at visiting knights. He says nothing. The steward stores secrets the way others store grain, tightly, carefully, and in bulk. He is not rich in gold, but he is rich in trust. He is allowed into rooms, others are not. Trusted with keys, with documents, with whispered instructions and dangerous knowledge. He sees the lord lose his temper, the lady weep, the priest falter. He remains calm. He always does. In the great feasts, when the hall roars with laughter and wine, the steward is not the one dancing or feasting. He is behind the scenes, checking that the wine will last the night, that the bread will reach the lower tables, that the firewood pile is tall enough to warm the hall by dawn. People forget the steward is there, that's the idea. But when the harvest fails, when the servants rebel, when the taxes go unpaid, they remember quickly, and they ask, where is he? He may not be loved, but he is needed. He may not dine with the nobles, but he makes sure they eat. He may not raise a sword, but he keeps the castle standing, quietly, behind the curtain. The noblewoman's chamber, gold, gowns and gilded cages. The door closes softly behind her. Thick, oak, polished, heavy. Inside the chamber, all is quiet. At first, there are no screaming children here, no squabbling hens, no mud-caked boots or smoke curling through roof beams. Instead, embroidery hoops, perfumed linen, silk slippers lined in rabbit fur, a silver mirror rests against the wall. Ivory combs sit in a carved box. The fire crackles politely in a neat stone hearth. This is wealth, but not freedom. She wakes early, not because she must, but because it's expected. The maid arrives with warm water in a copper bowl. She washes, slowly. Her skin smells faintly of lavender and ash. She does not choose her gown for the day. Her maid does. Layers of linen, then wool, then outer silks, if the occasion demands it. Some days she wears blue. Blue is the color of saints and wealth. Some days she wears red. Red is power, and she's told it flatters her complexion. She is not asked what she prefers, only that she must be seen. A noblewoman's day is not one of labor, but of performance. She must walk gracefully, not too quickly. She must speak clearly, not too loudly. Her hands should always be clean, her hair dressed, her expression calm and pleasant. She must be seen praying, seen sewing, seen smiling gently, seen reading. If she's among the lucky few who can read, she must not appear idle, but she must not appear busy either. That is for peasants. Outside her window, she can see the fields. Somewhere out there, other women trudge through frost, barefoot and bent. Sometimes she wonders what it smells like. Real dirt, real sweat, real hunger. Sometimes she doesn't. She was raised in a chamber like this, a little smaller, with fewer gowns, but still a world of polish and restriction. She was taught to curtsy before she could write her name, taught which fork to use, which glance to offer, which tone to speak in, when asking for more bread at the Lord's table, taught to obey the rhythm of a life she didn't choose. Marriage is a contract, not a story. She knew the man she would marry before she knew how to sew. His name was written alongside hers in a charter. She saw his face once before the wedding, once, and now she sees it every week, or month, or when he wishes. He travels often. She remains, managing the household accounts, overseeing the servants, hosting guests, appearing at feast days, sitting in church beside other women with nearly the same expressions, nearly the same gowns. She speaks with them of cloth, of saints, of illness and childbirth, and what the cook forgot to salt last week. They smile, always. She is not poor. She has rings. She has velvet. She has a prayer book with her initials stitched into the leather, a comb made of bone, a little lapdog that yips and spins, but she is not free. She cannot walk alone through the village, she cannot ride a horse without permission, she cannot leave, not without scandal, not without disgrace, not without risking everything. The walls of her chamber are beautiful, the windows open to sunlight and birdsong, but the lock is still there. Even if it's invisible, at night the maid helps her undress, one layer, then another, until it's just the shift against her skin. She sits by the fire, staring at the coals, thinking of nothing, or everything. She wonders what life might be like if she had been born with less, or more, or as someone else entirely. But she doesn't say it aloud, even her thoughts must be silent. The abbot's garden, luxury grown in silence. The bell rings low across the valley, deep, slow and heavy with morning. The sound rolls like mist through the cloister walk, through stone corridors, into the long dormitory where the monks are already awake. And at the edge of the monastery grounds, where the walls meet the fields and the fields meet the woods, the abbot walks. His garden waits. There is no rush in the abbot's steps. His robe brushes the path softly. He nods to the brother tending the beehives. Another trims the rosemary hedge. A third is bent low over the herb beds, carefully dusting frost from the sage leaves with the edge of his sleeve. This is not the kingdom of the sword. It is the kingdom of order, of patience, of silence. Inside the abbey, the world moves on a rhythm older than kings. Psalms rise like breath from the chapel. Ink stains the fingers of the scribes. Bread rises in stone ovens, and in the garden healing grows. Wormwood for the stomach, yarrow for the blood, fennel, mint, valerian, angelica. Each plant has its place. Each bed is bordered in neat wooden frames. No chaos, no disorder. The monks don't call it wealth, but it is. The abbot knows the value of silence. In silence, the garden speaks. A browning leaf, a crooked stalk, a bitter stem that needs drying before the feast day. He bends to pull a weed. His knees crack. His hands are stained with soil, though they have turned the pages of ancient manuscripts and signed letters sealed in wax and sent to noblemen far beyond these fields. The garden is holy. It is medicine and metaphor, symbol and substance. It is not decorative. It feeds the body. And sometimes, the soul, visitors to the abbey, do not always understand this quiet power. They see the stone buildings, the plain robes, the low speech. They think poverty, but they miss the fullness. The storerooms lined with honey jars, dried pears, smoked fish, the cellar with its neat barrels of wine, the buttery with its wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth and turned by candlelight, the chapter house where decisions are made, slowly, unanimously, and usually in Latin. The abbot's garden is only the edge of it. But what an edge it is. He pauses beside the quince tree. Its blossoms are early this year, just hints of pink in the chill air. He will write to brother Peter in York to tell him. Peter planted the cutting 3 springs ago before he was sent north to teach. He always loved the quince, said it reminded him of his mother's orchard, though she was long buried before he ever took the cloth. The abbot smiles faintly. He remembers everything. That's part of his work now. He returns to the cloister as the bell rings again. None of this was accidental. The abbey was placed here for a reason, on this slope, in this valley, beside this river. The soil is good, the trade routes pass nearby, and those who pass through from merchants to bishops, to weary pilgrims with mud on their boots, all pass through his gate. And they all remember the abbey's honey, or the calming wine, or the balm for aching joints made from plants they cannot name. They remember comfort. They remember peace. The abbot bows his head as he enters the chapter house. The garden waits behind him, soaking up the sun in quiet silence, but it will bear fruit again. Everything here grows, even power, even now. The bishop's palaces, holy gold and quiet wars. The city stirs early. Carts creak, hammers echo, market stalls unfold like petals opening to the dawn. But above it all, quiet and still and watching, is the bishop's palace. Not a castle, not quite, but no mere house either. It is stone and stained glass, a roof of lead tiles, tall doors and polished wood, and behind those doors, wealth moves quietly. You may imagine bishops as men of prayer, cloaked in incense and Latin, and they are. But they are also landlords, diplomats, judges, sometimes generals. This bishop, in this palace, rises with the bell, not the city's clamour, but the deep-toned toll of the cathedral tower, just across the courtyard. He does not lace up his own shoes, he does not carry his own keys, but he does carry something heavier, something older. Authority. His table is already set with bread, soft cheese, slices of apple. Not too much. Too much is for the nobles, too little is for the poor. The bishop must always seem balanced, even if the cellars beneath the palace are full of wine barrels, some stamped with foreign seals, even if the storerooms hold spices from the Levant, gifted by a visiting lord whose soul needed absolving in a hurry. This is not theft, it is tribute, holy tribute. Servants move silently. The bishop speaks softly, but the parchment on his desk bears the weight of empires. Letters sealed in wax from Rome, from noble families, from abbots, from the king. One of them is a land dispute, 2 villages squabbling over a half-dried stream. Another, a request for blessing on a second marriage. Though the first wife has only just been buried, he reads, he decides, his hand writes in a calm, practiced script. And just like that, the lives of peasants, priests and petty knights change. The bishop is not alone in power, but he is alone in knowing exactly how far it reaches. Beyond the walls of his palace are farms and vineyards, tenants and tithes. Every 10th bundle of wheat, every 10th piglet, every 10th coin from trade, all sent to the church, and from the church, to him. It does not feel like robbery, it feels like order, like the weight of heaven, measured in grain and silver. He walks through the garden cloister, fingers trailing across the tops of box hedges. He has walked this path every morning for 20 years. Here, he gave last rites to a dying abbot. There, he first met the architect, who would design the new altar. And beyond that wall, hidden in the private chapel, lie relics said to weep during storms. He does not believe all the tales, but he keeps them close, because people believe him. There are politics in every corner. When he visits the cathedral, the merchants bow. When he visits court, the nobles nod. And when war threatens, when lines on a map twitch like snakes disturbed, he meets with envoys. He speaks in the language of peace, but he carries the vocabulary of war. He once refused to bless a campaign. The soldiers said he was weak, but the villagers on the border said he was kind. He knows what kind of power that is. He knows how far it goes. He walks back inside before the rain starts, slow and clean on the lead roof above. Another day, another ledger, another whispered confession, another sealed letter sent off with a wax stamp and a flick of the wrist. The bishop kneels, finally, in the chapel. No words, just stillness. The kind of silence only those with nothing left to prove can keep. Above him, the painted saints watch from stained glass. He closes his eyes and listens. Even power, at this level, needs something deeper to root into. And then the bell rings again. A new hour, a new need. But the bishop does not rush. He never does. The court minstrel, rich in songs, poor in coin. The feast has long since ended. The nobles have drifted away, their laughter echoing through stone halls like distant birdsong. The servants sweep crumbs from the rushes, stack empty pitchers, collect the bones and pits left behind. And in a quiet corner, beneath a carved window glowing with candlelight, the minstrel sits alone with his lute. No one looks at him now. But just hours ago, every eye watched his fingers dance across strings. Every ear leaned into his voice. And now, silence. This is the life of a court minstrel, a life balanced between admiration and invisibility. He's not a servant. Not exactly. He's not a noble, not even close. He's an ornament. A voice brought out when the hall needs warming. A story woven when the Lord needs sleep. A little joy at the right moment, and a forgotten shadow the rest of the time. He sleeps in the servant's wing, if there's space. Sometimes in the stables, curled beneath a wool cloak that smells of hay and old leather. He eats what's left when the rest have finished. He owns his lute, his voice, and not much else. But when he sings, he can stop a room. His songs are not just for amusement. They are currency. A sad ballad to soften a lady's heart. A lively tale to keep the Lord's attention. A careful satire, veiled in humor, to remind the reeve he's being watched. Each verse is a step through a dangerous garden. Because in court, every word is weighed. Say the wrong thing, and you're a fool. Say it too clearly, and you're a threat. But say it well, and for a moment you're the most powerful man in the room. He knows 1,000 stories. Some are old, some are stolen, some are true, most are not. He knows how to make a crowd laugh with a clever twist, how to make them cry with a single chord, how to make a hall hold its breath. And when he plays at the fireside, when the wind howls outside the castle walls, and the guards lean in close, and even the hounds lie still, he becomes more than a poor man with a lute. He becomes memory, dream, hope even. But when the song ends, the spell breaks, the cups clatter again, the coins, if any, are tossed toward his feet with a lazy flick of the hand. He bows, smiling, always smiling. He collects them, always grateful, even when his fingers bleed, even when his voice cracks, because he knows tomorrow they might forget his name. Sometimes he travels from one lord's hall to another, on foot, mostly, cold, tired, blistered, but always welcomed, for a night or two, if he plays well, and keeps quiet, and flatters the right ears. Once he travelled with a troupe, jugglers, dancers, a trained bear with a mild temper, but they scattered when the war came. Now it's just him, and the songs he carries in his mind. He writes new ones in his head, walking between villages, verses about the fields, about love lost, about a knight too proud, and a goose too wise. He hums them to himself as he walks, because music doesn't weigh much, and even when your boots wear thin, a melody can carry you farther than bread. There was once a lady who said she loved his voice. She gave him a ring. He pawned it the next week for shoes. He still remembers the way her eyes looked when she listened, but he doesn't remember her name. It's safer not to. When the court sleeps, the minstrel sings one last song to himself. Soft, low, a lullaby, no one hears but him. It's about a man with no home, who carries stars in his pockets, about a king who traded his crown for a song, about a voice that could hold a heart together, if only for one night, and then he sleeps, wrapped in the silence between verses. The Chancellor's quill, writing the realm's will. The candle burns low. Its wax pools like quiet thought across the desk. And there, hunched in heavy robes, his ink-stained fingers resting on parchment still warm from his words, the Chancellor pauses, not because he is finished, but because he must think. Every stroke of his quill shapes not just sentences, but the very rules of the realm. He does not wear armor. He does not kneel at altars, but his is the power that creeps silently through corridors, that whispers into scrolls, that codifies the king's mutterings into law. The Chancellor writes the world into order, and unknots it when he must. He is not rich in the way merchants are rich. No velvet, no spices, no ships. He is not noble by birth. He cannot trace his blood back to warriors or saints, but his mind, his pen, that's currency rarer than gold, and far more dangerous. He knows the law like a lover, its habits, its tricks, its little phrases that can trap or free. He writes decrees that bind barons. He pens letters that send soldiers marching. He revises oaths, rewrites treaties, rewords apologies, because in the court, a single misplaced word can start a war, or stop one. And he, more than anyone, understands the weight of words. His chamber is not grand. It is lined with shelves, scrolls, bundles of parchment, ink pots, wax seals, knives for trimming quills, and a battered old sand shaker that leaks slightly. Outside, others dine, hunt, scheme, but he stays in the quiet, thinking, drafting, fixing commas that might cost someone their land, or their life. He is trusted by the king, but never embraced. Feared by the nobles, but never openly. Consulted by generals, whispered about by servants, avoided at banquets. He eats alone, by choice. Some say he writes too coldly. Some say he has no heart. But what they don't understand is this: he cannot afford one. He cannot weep over a law that will raise a tax. He cannot hesitate before drafting an execution order. His work must be clean, precise, unflinching, because in that flint-like clarity, justice, or at least order, can survive. Still, at night, when the castle sleeps and the bells are silent, the Chancellor sometimes lowers his pen and looks out the high window of his office. He listens to the wind move through the courtyard below. He sees the guards on their rounds. He wonders what songs the minstrels are composing tonight, what dreams are curling into corners of servants' beds. He once wanted to be a poet, but poets live on feelings, and feelings in his world are like spilled ink. They ruin everything. In the morning, he will present the new edict. He will stand before the king, the council, the court. He will speak carefully. He will listen to murmurs, objections, subtle shifts in posture, and he will win. Because he always does, not with a sword, but with syntax. The Chancellor's robes are plain, but his words are robes for the realm. They dress chaos in order, confusion in clarity. They hold the whole trembling weight of kingship in a few tight lines. And when he finally signs his name, small, neat, unreadable, it is not pride he feels, it is relief. Another day of keeping the kingdom stitched together with paper. Another night of silence earned. Another candle snuffed. The Queen's mirror, reflection of a life not her own. The mirror is silver, not polished glass, not the crisp shimmer of modern clarity, but soft, warped, and old. It doesn't just reflect, it remembers. And tonight, as the candles flicker low in the Queen's chamber, she gazes not into her face, but into the life she never chose. Behind the silk, the brocade, the careful braids, there is a woman made of quieter things, of cold mornings and colder duty, of smiles that ache by sunset, of choices whispered through closed doors, always about her, but never by her. To be queen in the medieval world was not to rule, it was to represent, to embody, to survive. The Queen is not without comfort, her sheets are linen, not wool, her food arrives hot, prepared by the best, her hands do not scrub, or lift, or bleed, but she is never alone, not truly. Every moment of her life is witnessed, ladied, advised, guarded, and most of all, watched. She wakes beneath a painted ceiling, to the rustle of servants and the expectations of a court that sees her as symbol first, soul second. Once, long ago, she believed in stories of noble marriages, of love, softened by silk and shared glances. But queens do not marry for love, they marry for peace, for treaties, for borders on a map that bear no mark of her hand. Her wedding day was not hers, it was the realm's. She has children, princes and princesses with careful tutors and stifled laughter. She watches them grow like vines trained to trellises, gently redirected, never wild. She teaches them grace, posture, silence. She teaches them not to cry too loudly, not to laugh too long, not to wish too openly, because she learned years ago that wishing is not part of royalty. And still, there are soft moments, the smell of lavender as a maid combs her hair, the flutter of birds at the high stone window, the hush of the chapel in early dawn. Sometimes she hums a song from her childhood. The tune is crooked now, like a path once walked in bare feet, now overgrown. She remembers laughter. She remembers running. She remembers being just a girl, not a crown. Her chamber is beautiful. Tapestries, candlelight, warm tiles underfoot. But it is not hers. She sleeps in a bed too large. She eats food too rich. She wears jewels she cannot pawn, and smiles she cannot remove. At night, when the fire sinks low and the rest of the castle sleeps, she rises, just a moment, to look in that old mirror and see herself not as queen, not as wife, not as mother, but as the echo of a name she once whispered to herself in secret. She doesn't speak aloud. She doesn't need to. The mirror already knows, and for a moment, it shows her not the life she's living, but the one she lost. Then slowly, the mask returns. The smile, the posture, the weight of royalty, wrapped in silk. She climbs back into bed. She turns her face toward the wall. Tomorrow she will be the queen again. The King's Chamberlain. Intimacy with the crown. He does not wear a crown. He does not ride into battle. He does not feast beneath banners or wave to cheering crowds. But every day, every hour, every quiet moment behind the throne, the King's Chamberlain is there. His footsteps fall softly over rush-covered floors. His hands lift parchments, shift robes, arrange silence. He is the man the king trusts most, though most would not recognize him passing in the corridor. His wealth is not of gold, but of access. He knows the king's habits, when he wakes, what he fears, how long he will brood before speaking. He knows which slippers the king prefers, which tunic makes him feel taller, and which names should never be spoken within earshot. He holds no sword, but he guards more than any knight. The chamberlain is not a servant, not quite. He is above that, but he is not noble either, not truly. His world is the thin, whispering space between royalty and responsibility, a life lived just outside the glow of power, but always in its heat. He manages the king's wardrobe, oversees the lighting of the chamber hearth. He holds the royal keys. He prepares the water for the king's bath, and if the king should fall ill, it is the chamberlain who will first see the sweat on his brow, the shaking of his hands, the weakening of a grip once feared by all. Some say the chamberlain is more dangerous than the king, because kings speak commands aloud, but the chamberlain whispers what to command. He controls access, watches the faces of visiting lords, intercepts bribes, discards threats, and smooths over the little indignities the king must never know. If a wine cup was cracked, it never reached the king's lips. If a scandal brewed too close, it disappeared like steam off a kettle. But this intimacy is isolating. The chamberlain knows much, but he cannot speak freely. He hears the king dream aloud in sleep. He knows of doubts, illnesses, sorrows too shameful to be recorded. He knows when the king has cried. And still he must bow, still he must carry the basin, still he must lock the chamber door, and stand guard while others sleep. There is a cot in the corner of the king's dressing chamber. That is where the chamberlain sleeps, when he sleeps, sometimes just for minutes, always lightly. He dreams not of crowns but of fires that must never be allowed to catch, dreams of messages misplaced, of candles burning too low, of the king calling his name in anger. Once, years ago, he was just a boy, the son of a baker, or a clerk. He remembers learning how to polish boots so the shine caught torchlight, how to speak softly, bow perfectly, vanish discreetly. He was chosen, not for strength, but for reliability. And now he sees everything. He sees the king grow older, sees the slight tremor return to his fingers, the way he repeats stories without realizing, the way he gazes too long at the fire, lost, and the chamberlain. He says nothing, because loyalty means silence, and silence in his position is power. When the king dies, it will be the chamberlain who prepares the final garments, who lays the ring beside the hands, who locks the door, and kneels quietly, one last time, and then he will serve the next king. The crowned head, royal sleeplessness, and endless rule. It is late, very late. A hush lies over the stone corridors of the great royal palace, so deep and muffled that even the wind outside seems to have forgotten its business. The servants have long since disappeared behind narrow doors. The hearths have dimmed. The clatter of goblets and silver dishes has faded to memory. The court is sleeping, but in a room high above the rest, the king does not sleep. The room is vast, but not grand, not in the way the court imagines. No gold leaf, no banners, just old wood, soft lamplight, and thick velvet curtains that do their best to hold back the world. There's a writing table by the window, scattered with scrolls, a candle burned nearly to the end, and there, at its edge, a pair of hands, strong once, now veined, freckled, lined with time. He sits hunched over a page, not reading, not quite writing, listening, not to a voice or a person, but to the strange silence that comes only to kings who have ruled too long. The kind of silence that is thick with things not said, not solved, not saved. There is always a moment, somewhere deep in the night, when a ruler knows they cannot fix everything. Not the bread shortage, not the bickering vassals, not the illness in their sons' lungs, or the whispers in the market square, and yet they sit with it, night after night, wearing the weight like a second crown. The king rises slowly, his joints click, his night robe rustles. He walks across the cold flagstones to the great window that overlooks the kingdom, not all of it, of course, but a slice wide enough to contain stories he will never hear. A flicker of torchlight along the city walls, the outline of rooftops clustered like folded paper, a dog barking, then silence again. How many nights like this? He cannot remember. The days blur, the duties stack. Each sunrise is another scroll to sign, another knight to reward, another cousin to pacify, another border to hold. And though he commands armies and signs laws and bends entire provinces to his will, he cannot command his own sleep. And this is not new, no. Even as a boy, he remembers watching his father pace those same stones, wearing down the edges with royal worry. He remembers the servants whispering, "His Majesty does not rest," and how no one dared ask why. He returns to the writing table. There's an open letter, half finished, meant for his daughter, in the northern fief. She had written last month, asking about court gossip, about inheritance, about what kind of man he would approve for her to marry. He had not answered. He cannot answer. The ink dries beside his silence. Somewhere below, the castle groans. Old stone does that, shifts, settles, holds secrets in its bones. He He has lived within these walls so long he knows every breath it takes, the scrape of weather across the roof tiles, the soft sigh of heat from the kitchen flues, even the footsteps of the guards, steady, rhythmic, loyal. They think he sleeps, they always do. He does not blame them. He trained them well. They watch his enemies, but no one watches the dark thoughts that circle a ruler's bed like moths to a dying flame. He thinks of his crown, not the one locked in the royal vaults or displayed on holy feast days, but the one he wears always, invisibly, the pressure behind his eyes, the tightness in his chest when he speaks to the council, the dreams that never come, or come far too vividly, full of horses and blood and old promises he cannot keep. Behind the curtain, the stars have shifted. Time moves, always it moves, even for kings. His old tutor used to say that sleep was the privilege of innocence. Peasants could sleep, even when they were hungry. Monks could sleep, wrapped in cold devotion. Even thieves, perhaps, after a long night's work. But kings, they sleep with open eyes, because every rest may be the last. Every silence might hide a rebellion. Every moment of stillness might cost them the realm. He pours a little wine into a goblet. It's cold now, but he drinks it anyway, more out of habit than hope. It does not warm him, it does not numb him, but it helps pass the time between now and dawn. He walks again, this time slower, and stops before a painting, an ancestor, maybe, one of the old warrior kings, painted in triumph with a battle behind him, and a laurel crown above. The king does not remember his name, only that the man in the painting died young, and was called Glorious. He wonders, does anyone call him Glorious now, or merely enduring? The oil lamp flickers low, the shadows on the ceiling stretch like hands reaching, the fire is out, the coals murmur and die, the room dims further. He does not light another flame, instead he lies back, not in bed, but on the bench by the window, the one lined with fir throws, the one where he sometimes closes his eyes for a few minutes, just to pretend. His eyes remain open, sleep does not come, but the memories do, of campaigns won, of lands lost, of coronations and funerals, of the queen, long gone now. Her laugh, the way she used to mock his brooding. You're not Atlas, she'd say. The world can spin without you for a night. But he never believed it. Down in the courtyard, a bell rings, not loud, just the little bell that marks the hour for the bakers. Still dark, but morning is beginning its slow approach. And here, in this lonely high room, the king remains, awake, always awake, because the realm never truly sleeps, and neither do its crowned heads. A candle burns low, its wax curled like old lace, forgotten in the corner of a high corridor. The king walks softly past it, his slippers hushed against the polished stone. No guards accompany him now. They know better than to speak during these hours. He prefers to drift unnoticed, a shadow in his own palace. The air smells faintly of lemon oil, beeswax, and the cold iron tang of swords stored behind closed armories. Above him, painted ceilings tell the stories he's supposed to remember. Battles won, oaths made, blood spilt and sanctified. But they don't speak to him now, not like they did when he was younger, when he still thought those stories had anything to do with sleep. In the treasury, coins lie in stacks too tall to count. Jewels sit in their velvet beds like watchful eyes, waiting to be worn but never loved. The crown itself, polished, padded, inscribed with lines of blessing, sits behind glass. He never looks directly at it. He looks at the floor, at the worn edges of rugs trodden by messengers, at the way the wall has been scraped just slightly, again and again by the same opening door. This is how he knows the realm is still alive, not through parchment treaties or cheering parades, but by noticing what wears down. Tonight he passes by the scribe's chambers. Inside, candles flicker over piles of vellum. An assistant sleeps with his cheek mashed against a scroll, something about grain imports from the south. The king doesn't wake him. He only watches for a moment, hands folded. It's strange, he thinks, how many people live this life around him. How many lives coil and uncoil in spirals of ink just outside his line of sight. At the end of the hall, a tiny door hides behind a tapestry. He slips through it like a ghost and climbs the stairs behind the walls. This is the old route, the one servants use when they don't want to be seen. He knows it well. He walked it as a child with a nursemaid, then as a young man chasing his thoughts when they got too loud. The steps creak in a particular way. Every seventh one makes a sound like a cough that hasn't changed in 40 years. The familiarity is comforting in a way that diplomacy never is. He emerges in a forgotten antechamber. Dust glows in the moonlight, stirred by his breath. This room was once meant for petitions, small things. Disputes over land, rights to bake bread in town ovens, requests for royal permission to marry outside one's station. He wonders whatever became of those requests. Did anyone remember them, once the ink dried? A long time ago, there had been a woman here, not a noble, not a servant, just someone who spoke softly and listened closely. She had once brought him warm wine when his hand shook too much to hold the pen. He does not remember her name, but he remembers her silence. It was the kind that understood everything. He misses that. From this high point in the castle, you can see out across the kingdom. Fields stretch like patchwork, gold, green, grey under the night. Rivers catch the moon like strips of torn silver. The lights in distant towns flicker in and out like fireflies. So many lives, so many tiny sleeping worlds. All of them nestled beneath the weight of his title. The crowned head, a symbol, they say, of order, of divine right, of legacy. He lets out a breath and feels none of that. Below in the kitchens, someone's baking early bread. He can smell it even up here. It mixes with the old smoke caught in the rafters and the lavender someone tucked into a wall niche years ago. He wonders if the baker slept. Probably not. The kingdom runs on the wakefulness of the invisible. He used to believe that knowledge would grant peace, that if he read enough, listened well enough, governed wisely enough, sleep would come. But ruling is not a riddle you solve. It is a burden you shift from shoulder to shoulder, never setting it down. The questions multiply. What happens if the granaries fail? What if the nobles fracture? What if the people stop believing in the stories they're fed? And beneath all that, the quietest question. What if I am not the right one? In his bedchamber, the sheets are freshly laid, the pillows fluffed, the curtains drawn, but he doesn't lie down. He sits instead in the carved wooden chair, the one that's been moved 5 inches closer to the window each year. Outside, a breeze rustles the orchard. A fox darts across the courtyard. Somewhere far off, an owl calls. The king closes his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember what silence once felt like. The council chamber waits. The throne room waits. The endless letters, the gifts from ambassadors, the subtle politics of seating arrangements, all of it waits. But for now, he doesn't need to be the king. Just a man with tired hands and a long shadow. In the corner of the room is an old trunk. He hasn't opened it in years. It holds nothing of value, technically. Just scraps, letters never sent, a wooden toy, a feather someone once gave him from a hawk's wing. But tonight, he kneels before it, opens it gently, and sifts through the past with reverent fingers, not to cry, not even to feel, just to remember that once there was a time before the wait, before the sleeplessness, a time before the crown. Downstairs, a servant stirs. The palace begins to wake again, and still, the king remains at the window, a silhouette against the greying sky, waiting for the sun, or for something softer than dawn. The sun does rise eventually. It always does. But it takes its time. The light does not pour through the royal windows like glory. It seeps in slowly, cautious, like a servant who isn't sure if the king is still asleep. The shadows stretch first, long and soft, brushing the edges of carved stone and embroidered curtains. Then comes the pale warmth, touching the gold leaf on the walls, the cold silver basin on the table, the half-drunk glass of watered wine. He hasn't moved much, still in the chair, still wrapped in that old memory of wood, window, and waiting. There are footsteps beyond the door now, quiet ones. They know he dislikes noise in the morning. Or perhaps they know he dislikes mornings altogether. His valet coughs once, just outside, and waits. The king says nothing. Eventually the door opens, gently, and someone slips inside with fresh linens and warm water. A bird flutters past the window. Another day has begun. And so the machinery creaks back to life. But the king delays, as always. He does not dress right away. He walks barefoot across the cold stones, letting the chill wake his bones more gently than any horn or herald ever could. He looks out across the gardens, trimmed to perfection, as if nature itself had signed an oath of obedience, and watches a gardener shake dew from a bush. That gardener will never see the king watching him, but the king sees him clearly. The way his back bends, the way his sleeves are always damp, the way he sings to himself, unaware. It is a simpler kingdom out there, not smaller, but simpler. Down the corridor, breakfast is already being arranged. Silver trays with soft cheeses, spiced fruits, warm oatcakes, little dishes of preserved lemon. The steward has written the day's schedule in crisp black ink. meetings with envoys, a review of the northern garrisons, 2 hours with the young prince, who must be trained not in war or books, but in how to sit, how to be seen. Visibility is the first language of kingship, and the hardest to learn. But before all of that, there's the chapel. He walks there slowly, alone. Guards are posted, but they face outward, always outward. The walk is lined with statues, kings before him, some long dead, some only recently carved into history. Their eyes are blank, their robes forever stiff. He walks past them every day, and wonders how many of them were truly awake when they ruled. Not alive, awake. There is a difference. One can live a whole life behind gold and still never see the color of their people's eyes. The chapel is small, too small for pomp. The real shows of piety happen elsewhere, in cathedrals and ceremonies. But this place, the tucked-away space of carved oak, flickering oil lamps and worn kneelers, feels closer to something honest. A place without watchers, only echoes. The king does not pray. He hasn't in years. He listens instead, to the soft groan of the timbers, to the wind curling beneath the doors, to the silence between his breaths. He remembers when he used to believe in divine sleep, the kind that came with peace, with favor, the kind you read about in scripture. But gods sleep only in stories, and kings perhaps even less. Later, the court is in session. Faces smile and bow. There's laughter in the audience chamber. Controlled, pleasant, meaningless. Courtiers arrive wrapped in brocade and honeyed compliments. They speak of grain taxes and trade routes, of disputes over river borders and accusations of stolen sheep. Somewhere in the chaos, a young girl sings for the court, her voice too soft to fill the room, but sweet enough to make 3 nobles weep, not because of her song, but because she reminded them of something they forgot. The king watches it all, participates, nods, speaks when needed. His voice is steady, his posture perfect, but inside he feels the same growing space. An echo chamber built of velvet and mirrors, a sense that everyone in the room is playing at reality, and he is the only one who knows it's a game. Afterward, when the chamber clears and the candles are trimmed, the king sits for a moment with his hands folded in his lap. No one speaks. A servant shifts uneasily, but the king is not angry. He is only listening, to something quieter than words, to the faint creak of history, folding in on itself. There are letters from other kings, requests for alliances, subtle threats, invitations dressed as compliments. He answers them all with the practiced hand of a man who no longer believes in sincerity, but respects the art of pretending. Each line is crafted to say what is expected, and nothing more. No one in power tells the truth, not because they are liars, but because the truth is too heavy for such delicate paper. That evening, the king eats alone. A simple meal, bread, wine, a stew that tastes of time and quiet years. He eats slowly, not because he's savoring it, but because he is remembering. How many meals has he eaten like this? How many more will come and go without notice? The taste does not matter, only the moment of stillness. Later still, a visitor comes, unexpected. The prince, his son, young, unsure, already heavy with the knowledge of inheritance. He asks nothing, just sits across from his father in silence. They share a fire, they share blood, they do not share sleep. After the prince leaves, the king walks again. The halls are darker now, fewer servants, fewer sounds. This is the time he loves best. The world asleep, or nearly, the kingdom soft around the edges. He finds himself back in that tiny antechamber, the one behind the stairs, the one with the dust and the stories buried beneath layers of paint. He lights a candle, not to see, but to feel the warmth. The crown is elsewhere, locked in its ceremonial chest. It is never far, yet never close. Just like the idea of peace, he sits down, not on a throne, just on a wooden bench, carved by someone whose name was never recorded. It creaks under his weight. The sound pleases him. Outside, night blooms again, and in the dark, the king does not close his eyes. He listens to a kingdom that breathes without knowing who he is. The night deepens, though it doesn't darken much more. The castle stone never truly yields to blackness. Lamps glow somewhere at every hour. Torches flicker down long halls, and the moon hangs like a lantern over slate roofs and silent courtyards. Still, something settles. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask permission. The king remains where he sat, the flame beside him small and wavering. A dog outside barks once far away. He doesn't move. Once, when he was still a boy with skinny arms and a voice too soft to echo in halls like these. His mother told him that kings never die. They fade, perhaps, they diminish. But they don't die, not really. Their faces are carved in stone, their words copied in ink, their choices rippling out across time, long after their hands have stilled. He hadn't believed her. He doesn't believe her now. But sometimes, in these hours, he wonders what remains of the man beneath the title. He remembers the coronation, the impossible weight of it. He remembers the smell of the wax and the incense, and the wool of the kneeling cushions. He remembers being anointed with oil that smelled of myrrh and dust and something older than all language. He was told it was sacred. He was told he had changed. But after the ceremony, he had walked alone down a stone corridor, out of sight, and leaned against the wall, just for a moment, just to breathe, and he remembers thinking, I am the same. My hands still shake, my feet still ache. I am a boy in a borrowed myth. That myth has never quite fit. The candle gutters low. He lets it die, rising. He walks once more, not to his chambers, not to the chapel, not to the throne. Instead, he climbs. Past servants' doors and storage rooms, past dust and darkness, and places even the stewards forget. Up narrow steps that twist like questions. The tower room has no furnishings, no guards, just a single window and a sky full of cold stars. From here the world is quiet, not still. He can see flickers of firelight in cottages beyond the walls, hear the faint rush of a stream below, but quiet in a way that feels honest. Nothing bows up here, nothing flatters. He stands at the window, both hands resting on the stone ledge. His knuckles are thinner now than they once were. The rings hang loose. He sees the roofs of the city, the chapel spire, the market square, the stone bridge, all of it sleeping, all of it real. And somewhere out there, a woman is feeding a crying child. A baker is shaping dough by moonlight. A soldier is sharing a joke beside a brazier. A drunk is whispering an old song he barely remembers. They do not know their king is watching them. They do not care, and that is a gift. There is no one left to impress. No one to measure his silence or interpret his frown. No robes, no crown, no retinue. Just a man with sore feet, a tired spine, and too many memories that never quite let him rest. He thinks of the young prince again. He had looked older last night, not taller, not stronger, but heavier. Not in body, but in burden. It starts early, that weight. Even when the crown hasn't touched your head, you feel it in your bones. The inheritance of expectation, of being watched, of having to be more than yourself. He hopes the boy finds a way to sleep, to laugh, to forget. Even briefly, the performance of power. He himself has not forgotten, but he remembers trying, and that, he decides, is something. The stars shift above him, slow, silent revolutions that heed no crown. Below, the city breathes. The king turns from the window at last, and begins the slow descent. Step by step, stone by stone. His joints ache, but he does not complain. He has grown used to quiet pain. Back in the hallway, he passes a servant asleep on a bench, mouth slightly open, head lolled to one side. The man is young, unaware, dreaming. The king does not wake him. He walks past gently, like a ghost. At the chamber door, he pauses. He could go inside. He could lie in the great bed and pretend to rest, eyes closed but mind racing. He could wait for morning with silk sheets over his skin and dread in his chest. But instead, he walks past the door. One more turn of the corridor, one more breath in the hush of the high walls. He passes a mirror, does not look into it. And finally, he returns to that same old chair by the window. The one he first sat in last night, or perhaps years ago. Time has become soft-edged. He sits, and this time he leans back fully, lets the weight of everything press into the worn wood. The crown is nowhere near. The court is asleep. His body is tired, his hands open. The moonlight finds him there, pale and pale still, and for the first time in a long time, he closes his eyes, not in command, not in fear, but in rest. And though the dreams do not come, neither do the ghosts, only silence, only breath, only sleep.